So we basically got this afternoon divided into 3 parts, and we put the schedule online. But basically, the first part is the introduction, and we had identified a couple of people, Donnie Bu and Mohammed Najim. I'm not sure if they're actually in the room quite yet. Everybody's having trouble finding the room, among other problems with lines. But we'll be fairly fluid. But so first, it's just presenting the project overhaul and answering people's questions about where to find the data and so on. Then the second segment will be focused more on advocacy, so ideas for advocacy using the data. And the third segment will be focused on research. But we're not going to be super rigid about this plan. So, if you have a research idea that's really burning and you need to interject it at a point that's not in the appointed research time or something, people aren't going to shut you up. We'll be fairly flexible and fluid with our agenda, depending on what people want to talk about and what ideas people have and how deeply people want to brainstorm on particular points. Because the value of this is as much to listen to the people in the room. So I also encourage, there's a lot of seats up at the front, so I encourage people to move up to engage in discussion. It would be nicer if we had more of a semicircle or something. But with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a relatively brief presentation just on the overall findings and talking about what we did, what some of the most interesting findings were. Then I'll give you a little bit of a tour of our website so that you can kind of see where to find things and particular types of data and information that you might be interested, because there's a lot there to navigate. Then if Donnie and Mohammed are here to comment, we can get some comment from them. Otherwise, we can get just comments from anybody. We really just kind of have certain commentators on the program as sort of pre-planned comments. But I imagine that everybody in the room has a lot to say and a lot of ideas and a lot of reactions. So this is not a one-way thing going on here. So what is the problem that we're trying to deal with? I mean, as David was saying, this is a problem that people here at the IGF don't need a lot of explaining, that people are increasingly dependent on internet and digitally networked mobile services for all aspects of their lives. And so increasingly, the technical choices that these companies are making, their rules about what you can and cannot do, what they collect about you, who they share it with, under what circumstances, all of this has an impact on our freedoms and rights in the physical world as well as in the online world. And so therefore, it's important that these companies be committed to respect our rights. And of course, they're increasingly mediating our relationship with governments. We have Kelly from Korea here, and Korea was the first country that elected a president with online internet mobilization. And of course, governments are increasingly using these technologies to learn more about us and what we're doing, sometimes with our consent, sometimes not so much. And so increasingly, again, the commitments or lack thereof that companies make to respect our rights have a real impact on our lives. So we need to make sure that the companies involved are being proactive about respecting rights, or we're not going to have a human rights compatible internet. And as we also learned, we have colleagues here at the IGF from Freedom House, and they just recently released their annual report where they were showing that levels of internet freedom are declining for the 5th year in a row. One of the things they pointed out was increasing pressure on companies to carry out surveillance and censorship. So this issue is more and more important. So what did we do with the index itself? Now, I think all of you have one of these handouts on your desk. If anybody didn't get one, there's sort of extras lying about, particularly in the front. People can take a look. And so you can see the list of companies. There's also a FAQ that has more information about the project, and so you're welcome to kind of look along at that as I talk, because there's a lot of information in here. But we looked at 16 companies. That's not a lot, considering all the companies who are having an impact on us, but this is what we could manage with our resources. 8 internet, 8 telecommunications. So for the internet companies, I don't know how well you can see this, but there's also the list here. We looked at several of the U.S. internet companies that have global impact that people all around the world are using. We also, because this is a global index, we did also choose a Russian company, Mail.ru, which also owns Vkontakte, which is Russia's Facebook, which a lot of people depend on, and also a chat service that a lot of people use. And also Tencent, which runs the very popular WeChat, which is used by people increasingly around the world, among other social networks. And then we also looked at Kakao, a Korean company that has both internet and chat services, and you'll be hearing more about them later, because I think they are an example of how these issues are not just Western issues, and there are companies that are not Western companies that are also taking these issues seriously. On the telco side, we basically selected a distribution of companies headquartered in different parts of the world and with different regional footprints so that we could overall collectively cover sort of users of telecommunications, internet and mobile services in a range of different markets. And so this is a slide of what you're seeing here. It's much easier to see it on your paper, I think, than seeing it up there. But as you'll see, out of a total possible score of 100, the highest scoring company was only 65%. So most everybody failed. And what was interesting is that basically these red lines here are the 30% mark. So all the companies under the red line in the internet and telecommunications got less than 30%. And basically, through our research, we determined that if you were getting less than 30%, you were not making a meaningful effort. That above 30%, there was evidence of at least some type of effort on certain aspects, even if deficient. But under 30%, it was really, you know, in terms of the scores that companies got, it was hard to tell if it was a result of concerted effort for freedom of expression and privacy or just for some other reason that they were getting those scores. So that's kind of the overarching data, and I'll kind of guide you through the website later. On the website, you can actually toggle through the different categories, and we had 31 indicators divided into 3 different categories. The first category is commitment, which is looking at the company's overarching policies and their efforts to implement those policies. The second is freedom of expression, and I'll walk you through kind of what that means in terms of the company's policies and practices affecting freedom of expression, and then privacy. On the website, you can toggle amongst these different things. You can click on the company names to see the individual company reports. You can click on categories and so on, and I'll show you that in a minute. So the point being is that there are no winners. While there are some companies that got higher scores than others and that showed more efforts than others, I would not consider any of them to be remotely satisfactory. This is a diagnostic test. This is not a certification. So just because a company got, you know, one of the higher scores doesn't mean that they are being given any kind of stamp of approval. So just to clarify that. And we also saw great variation. So a company that got a high overall score tended to have some areas in which it nonetheless performed very poorly. So that's also something to keep in mind. So let's take privacy, for example, which is an area that a lot of people are concerned about. And the privacy category, the indicators in this category dealt with a range of things, including, are the privacy policies clear, publicly available? Does the company communicate about what it's collecting, what it's sharing with whom, under what circumstances, how long it's retaining data, those types of questions. Also questions about transparency. What are your policies for handling third-party requests for user data? And then is there any transparency reporting about how many requests you're getting for user data and what you're handing over and so on? Also a set of questions about security practices. So as you'll see, the scores were in general not great. This is kind of how they played out down the line. But you'll see when we get indicator by indicator things switch around quite a lot. So for instance, on indicator P3, and in the website you can go through every single indicator one by one, does the company disclose what user information it collects, how it collects this information, and why? Kakao, a Korean company, got the highest score, followed by Facebook, which has been under a fair amount of stakeholder pressure to disclose this kind of information. Then you have sort of a random clump of companies whose disclosure is all roughly the same. Then we kind of go down from there. So the things play out in a very varied way from indicator to indicator. Google, which got the highest score overall, is quite mediocre in this particular indicator. Disclosure about sharing of user information. So this is, does the company disclose if and how it shares user information with third parties? Kakao got the top score again. Yahoo came in second. Look where Google ended up. So to really kind of understand the data and sort of what's going on, you need to get beyond sort of the overall scores and go indicator by indicator and look at what are the questions that you really care about and how did the companies do on those individual questions, because it varies greatly. And these, I was earlier today talking to a group of African NGOs about the index and how they might use it, and so I kind of highlighted a few of the companies that are particularly prevalent in Africa and so on. And so how about freedom of expression? What are we dealing with here? This relates to primarily content restriction. Are the companies notifying, are their terms of service clear? Are they clear about what is and is not allowed? Do they notify users when they restrict content? Do they publish their process for handling requests by third parties to take down or remove or block content? Come on in, we have a lot of space at the front here. Their identity policies, how they're handling their identity policies, et cetera. And again, you can go into the website and look at the full list of questions, and I'll give you a few examples of some of the freedom of expression category. So this is the overall category, the overall score for freedom of expression. We had Google first, then Kakao, then Twitter. So again, Kakao being the poster child for this is not just something that Western stakeholders or Western companies are doing. When we come to specific indicators, so for instance, does the company publish any information about its process, not data about requests, but just its process for how it handles and responds to third-party requests to take down content? Do they publish anything about that process? We only have about, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 companies that publish anything about that process. And oddly enough, Orange, which is one of the companies, evaluated for this question, they're a member of what's called the Telecommunications Industry Dialogue that makes commitments on user rights, and they got a 0 score on that, while Vodafone got the top score. But then we kind of move further into transparency reporting around freedom of expression. So in terms of the number of companies that report any data about government requests that they receive, not to hand over information, that's in the privacy category, but just about content removal and restriction and account restriction, how many requests they're getting. We have only 6 companies that reveal any data about content restriction, account restriction requests, so freedom of expression related stuff. So this isn't the surveillance part, that's in the privacy section. Only 6, and including these 2 industry dialogue companies report nothing. When it gets to data about private requests to remove content, now many of you are aware that increasingly in more and more countries, it's not just governments asking companies to take down content. You get these associations for this and that issue, be it the associations against hate speech or child pornography or et cetera, that are giving companies blacklists to take things down. And a lot less transparency on that than there is about government requests. Only 4 companies are providing any information about private requests. How about data about terms of service enforcement? What is the volume and nature of takedowns that the companies do themselves to enforce their terms of service? Nobody reports any data at all on what they're taking down or restricting to enforce their terms of service. This is a problem. This is a black box. And some of the companies that we talked to in the course of doing this acknowledged that they would be open to conversations about how to do this. And we can talk a bit more, I think, in our discussion, because I've been hearing already from some NGOs about interest in trying to improve this, which is problematic. So in terms of good news, there is some good news, and we already saw some. There's some companies like Kakao that a lot of people who are not Korean have not heard of, that are actually doing quite well. And I hope that in future, if we're able to expand the number of companies, we'll be able to highlight more good practice from places that aren't in the news headlines every day in the international media. But in our commitment section, where we're looking at, not only is the CEO and the company making commitments, public commitments to respect user rights, but are these institutionalized? Is there oversight over freedom of expression and privacy issues at the board level, at the executive level, or at management level? Is there training of employees on freedom of expression and privacy? Does the company carry out human rights impact assessment to assess various risks to user freedom of expression and privacy that may arise in the course of their doing business? Are they doing this assessment so that they can then try to mitigate and prevent problems and make business choices accordingly? Are there whistleblowing mechanisms so that somebody within the company can report on violations and abuses? Are there what we call grievance and remedy mechanisms so that if a user or somebody in society who's affected by the company feels that their right to freedom of expression or privacy has been violated by this company's business practices in some way, do they have the opportunity to lodge a grievance and get some kind of response or remedy, depending on what the issue is? So that's kind of what happens in the commitment section. And to highlight a few things that's rather interesting, there were 4 companies in the index that are members of what's called the Global Network Initiative, which is a multi-stakeholder organization that tries to get companies to actually sign on to some core principles around freedom of expression and privacy, mainly dealing with government requests, and then these companies agree to be assessed. So not only do they have to sign on to the principles, but they go through an independent assessment process that verifies whether they're actually doing anything. And so Microsoft, Yahoo, and Google have all been through that assessment process. Facebook joined GNI. They haven't been through the assessment process yet. But what we are seeing some kind of relationship between commitment scores and membership in this. There's also something called the Telecommunications Industry Dialogue, which is a group of mainly European telcos plus AT&T that have signed on to some principles that are basically adapted from the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And the other companies that scored well on commitment are members of the Industry Dialogue. One of the weaknesses of the Industry Dialogue is they don't carry out assessments. So what that means is you just have to take them at their word that they're doing what they're doing, whereas the GNI actually has independent assessors come in and verify, and there are stakeholders, including Human Rights Watch and others, who don't lightly put, and CPJ and so on, that don't lightly put their name on things, that certify basically the company is carrying out the principles. So it's interesting that we're finding some correlation between companies signing on to these organizations and actually enacting their commitments and kind of what we've been assessing in this category. But it's also important to note, because we were also looking at the freedom of expression and privacy categories and very, very basic level, user level practices. There are some companies that are scoring high on this and not scoring so well on those other more practical categories. So that's another thing to note, and that's one of the reasons why I really wanted to do this index, was to kind of raise the lid on that a bit. So one of the questions in this section is about human rights impact assessments. Does the company disclose that it conducts human rights impact assessments, and are they sufficiently broad and thorough based on what they disclose to the public? Yahoo actually came in first on human rights impact assessment. They got in trouble several years ago about practices in China, and then set up a business and human rights program and began to get more serious about assessing risks before kind of bumbling into markets and finding themselves in bad situations. On the other end of the spectrum, Twitter provides no evidence that it conducts any kind of human rights impact assessments whatsoever. And Twitter actually, I'm just going to go back here for a moment to the commitment section generally. Twitter did not do particularly well in the commitment section overall. And that's because while Jack Dorsey and previous leadership of the company have made a lot of good statements about how they're committed to users' rights, and on certain specific indicators within both the privacy and freedom of expression category, they score pretty well, they provide no evidence that they've institutionalized their commitments. So no evidence of training of employees, no evidence of board or executive oversight on freedom of expression and privacy, no evidence of whistleblowing, their grievance and remedy mechanisms are not particularly good, et cetera. So that's just something to think about and to perhaps ask them about. On grievance and remedy, also very interesting, the two companies, the telco that did the best on grievance and remedy was from India, RT Airtel. One of the reasons is that there's actually a law requiring telcos in India to have a grievance officer and to have some grievance mechanisms. On the internet side, the company that did best on grievance and remedy, just by a little bit, but still came out first, is Kakao. And that seems to also be related to regulation in Korea as well. But I think what we're seeing with these kind of generally low scores is that the industry hasn't been doing nearly enough about remedy. Nobody's quite sure how to do it properly. So maybe we can all help them do it better by helping them think through how to innovate on this, because it is difficult when you've got users all over the world, and how do you manage complaints in a meaningful way. So I'm going to get to sort of our recommendations, and I'll show you a little bit about the website, and then we can open this up more. So our key recommendations for companies, and there are more details in here and much more detail in the report, which you can download or read online. First of all, companies do need to carry out risk assessments. It's really important. There's a lot of things that can never be publicly disclosed in order for a company to run. How do we know that you're acting responsibly and that you're actually identifying your risks and your problems? If you're carrying out risk assessments. And so if there's no evidence that a company is carrying out risk assessments, that points to the likelihood that the company is not approaching these challenges in a holistic way, and that there may not be clear management oversight over this. And it's not that we want companies to publish every detail of their risk assessment online, because if they're being honest with themselves and doing a thorough evaluation, obviously there's going to be things that they're not going to publish, but they should be publishing the fact that they carry them out, and they should be publishing the fact that they cover certain types of issues. And so basic information about risk assessments should be possible. Companies need to be transparent and accountable not only about government requests, and so we applaud that more and more companies are doing transparency reporting, but most of that transparency reporting is only about government requests. And we're seeing all over the world a growing number of private requests, not only to take down content, block content, disable accounts, but also in many countries, requests for user data and so on. It's very unclear what's going on. And in many cases, companies didn't even clearly state whether they entertain private requests or not. even though in private they said, of course we don't entertain private requests. Why are you giving us no credit? And I'm like, well, because you don't say anywhere publicly whether you entertain this or not. You think your users are just going to automatically know this? Not if they aren't telecommunications lawyers, right? So part of this is companies need to talk to their users, not just to regulators. They need to communicate to users what users need to know to understand what's happening with their information and what they're able to access and not. Communicate clearly about what happens to users' information. Our definition, and it's on the website and in the report, our definition of user information includes metadata. It includes anything that could potentially link the individual to an identity, not just kind of your name and address and so on. And so if somebody were to create a dossier about you based on your use of your telco, your use of your mobile phone service, your use of a particular internet service, what would that look like? The company needs to tell that to you in a way that you can access. What do they have on you that somebody else could use? And you should have access to that information. We need effective grievance and remedy mechanisms, and of course we need security practices. We need evidence that the companies are engaging in industry standard security practices. We want to see encryption everywhere that it's not a public communication to begin with. This is all very important. We also have recommendations to governments. Aha, Natalie made it. She just got off the plane. Recommendations for governments are very important because as you go through the company profiles that we have on the website and in the report, there are obviously a lot of cases where regulation and law are preventing companies from disclosing everything they should or from engaging in best practices. So we need to, of course, bring laws and regulations into line with companies' ability to respect users' rights and to inform users. And there are a lot of laws that either don't allow companies to disclose certain information, or in many more cases, the laws are just really ambiguous about what companies are or are not allowed to disclose when it comes to requests to take down content or share user information under different circumstances. And so laws need to enable companies to maximally disclose this information. Governments should also be transparent and accountable. We need to see governments doing transparency reporting. And there's a number of NGOs in Korea. I know the Kelly's organization has been involved with a transparency reporting project about what the Korean government is asking of companies. There's a few other projects like that, but we need to see governments, any government that's signed on to the Open Government Partnership, if they're not willing to be open about this kind of data, how real is that commitment when we really get down to it? So that's kind of the basic overview. I'm going to give you a quick tour of the website, and we can kind of go back to that later. I'm just going to sit here while I figure out my mouse and bring this into position. So this is the front of the index. When you go to rankingdigitalrights.org, you get our website, which is loading slower than it did this morning. But that's the website you get. And it's got a blog and updates and things like that. And then you get to our index by just clicking on Corporate Accountability Index. And we've got it organized like we do on the handout with the internet companies and the telcos. You can toggle between different categories. So if you're interested in which internet companies are better on commitment or which telcos are better on freedom of expression, you can toggle that around. You can also click through to see individual company reports. So for instance, how did Orange do? They got 37%. You can see how they did on each category. You can see how they did in relationship to the other telcos in each category. Then there's some written analysis, and you can kind of drop down to read kind of everything. And some of this is about, which indicators they have no excuse to be doing better on, which indicators, there are some legal challenges or regulatory challenges, et cetera. And then you can go down and see indicator by indicator how they did on each indicator. So for instance, let me find one where there's, so this is orange, impact assessment. You can see, you can kind of go through how we scored that indicator at different levels and see what they got points on and what they didn't get points on to actually add up to their final score. So we had kind of subsections with orange. So with all the telcos, you'll see different levels here. With all the telcos, we looked at the group level, and then because telcos have operating companies in lots of different countries, and we don't have millions and millions of dollars, so we couldn't look at, you know, all the different operating companies for every single telco. So what we did is we looked at the operating company in the home market and two services for that operating, one or two services, depending on whether they have both mobile and fixed line broadband for that market. So we, in the case of Orange, we looked at Orange France, and then their mobile under Orange France and their fixed line under Orange France. And the idea being that if their disclosure is only a certain amount in their home market, so if they're only telling their family so much, that probably people further afield, they may be telling even less, or they're probably not telling more in most cases. But again, there's a lot of fertile ground because, say, for example, if you're from Tunisia, you might want to apply these questions to Orange in Tunisia, and you might get different scores. I don't know if they'd be higher or lower, but you know, you could apply that, or Orange in some other market. But this gives a basic sense of how they stack up with their home market and their operating company where they're making commitments, you know, for their global operations. So then the other thing you can do is you can click on different sections. So for instance, if you click on privacy here, you get the overall analysis for kind of how companies performed, and this is a fair amount of text, but it kind of, again, provides context, and you can also download the PDF, and I'll show you where to download that. But you can then go through indicator by indicator and look at how companies scored across the board. There's this menu here, the index. It's on all pages within the 2015 index. And there's this link that says download. This is where you go to download the data. And you can also download a PDF of the report so that you can read it on your e-reader when you're not connected to the internet, or print it out, read it offline, whatever you want to do, sell it. It's Creative Commons attribution only. You can do whatever you want with it. But even of more interest to many people is you can download the data. And this is the raw spreadsheet. This is due to Alon's very hard work organizing all of this and coming up with all the scoring formulas. And, you know, you want to know how the data got organized and how the scores got put together. Ask Alon, don't ask me.
Don't blame Alon if there's something wrong. That's a team effort.
No, Alon is a details man. So far, nobody's come up with any issues. But so this is kind of the not pretty version of the prettier version you see on the website of just kind of the different companies and their scores. And then you get sort of an overview of the different scores. And then you can go tab by tab and look at every company, sort of every score they got at every level, plus the comments. So I'm just going to show you here. This is obviously something you need to do on your own computer. But the comments, for instance, so here's the comment from the researcher explaining why they gave those particular scores for that particular service for this indicator. So it goes through in great detail, all the way through every single indicator, every single score, and there are also sources. So take with America Movil again. This is the results. Let's see. I gotta scroll left. There we go. Yeah, so that's kind of, that helps you see how the score got generated. And then there's also a list of sources. So for every company, there's 3 tabs. And the final tab for the company is links to all the sources. So within the spreadsheet, there's kind of a number for each source, and then you can go here and you can look at the actual document that our researchers reviewed to determine the score. So it's all there. And what's important about this is that what we didn't do is we didn't assign different weights to different indicators. So every indicator had the same weight. And we did this because people don't agree about what's more important than what. It sort of depends on where you're coming from. And so you could take this data, add your own weights to it, or remove half the indicators, or only look at chat services, or only look at mobile or something, and develop your own ranking just of those, and create your own graphics if you wanted to. I mean, this is all completely open license. So as long as you give us credit for being the origin of the data, you're welcome to create your own charts and graphs and reports and add research to it and so on. So that's pretty important that we wanted to make sure that was available. And I think that's pretty much, let me see if there's anything, is there anything else I should show people so as people are kind of poking around on the website, they can see. The other thing, yeah, and then this is the indicator page, which this is a page that has each indicator one by one, and then you can click on the link for the indicator to just get, drill down on what the indicator was looking at. You can also see a summary of the guidance we gave to researchers for how to interpret the questions. So, and we had some even more detailed things that are still a little too drafty to share, but we can, eventually get those out as well. But so it's an opportunity for people to go through in great detail and think about, what questions do you want to be asking companies if you were to duplicate the research with other companies than the ones we looked at, how might you do that, and so on. So I think that's pretty much that. And then the other links here are really kind of, we just replicated sections of the report on the website so that it's all there if you don't want to download it and read the PDF, which is here. So, yeah. So I'm not sure if Donnie or Mohammed are here. Is Donnie here? Hi, Donnie. Did you want to kind of make any comments about how you might be interested in using it, or do you want to do that in the next session, or what are you thinking? After the Q&A? Okay, great. So yeah, and I kind of don't really view this so much as Q&A than as sort of a brainstorm, and it's kind of too bad that we have this format. But maybe we can, Natalie, can we enlist you to run around with a mic?
Yeah.
If you're not too jet lagged.
I need to keep moving or else I'll fall asleep.
So,
Like that.
very good. So if you don't mind, and does anybody have any comments initially or questions? Yep.
I was just wondering how, I'm sure you talked to the companies about the feedback or about the results. I was wondering how receptive or not they were to what you were telling them and to the results.
Sure. So our process with companies was that it's sort of in various layers. So when we were developing the methodology, we actually published various versions of the methodology online, and kind of let companies know as much as we could. So we gave them an opportunity to provide feedback back at that point if they wanted to. We also did a pilot study where we didn't release the names of the companies and their results, but we talked to the companies about the results. So they kind of knew we were doing that. And then when we started this, after we revised the methodology after doing the pilot study, when we started the research for this index, we notified every single company that they were the lucky winners of being in our index, and that we would be in touch with them in a month or so with their preliminary results. We sent preliminary results to all the companies in July, and I would say about half of them eventually provided some feedback in terms of, I mean, the methodology itself is looking at publicly available information, so we're looking at what companies disclose, you know, the commitments they're making publicly, what they're telling users about what they do. So if they have really great policies but they're super secret, they don't exist for the purposes of the ranking. So there were some cases where companies came back to us and said, well, we actually do this, that, and the other thing, and we have this internal document we can share with you. And we're like, well, on the day that you actually make this a public document, we'd be really happy to give credit in the next ranking. But we're very sorry, we can't give credit for it now. So I guess the point is that in theory, a company could actually do quite well on the ranking without engaging with us. So it was not necessarily a requirement that companies had to respond in order for us to rank them. But the companies that tended to score better also tended to provide feedback. You know, and again, some of their feedback had some impact on their scores, but it didn't always. The reaction varied from company to company. There were some companies that say, you know, this has been a really useful exercise for us to kind of get a sense of how people externally view what we're doing, and kind of what questions are being asked. I've heard from 2 of the companies since we actually published the index, and those 2 particular companies were among the higher scorers, not the top scorer, by the way, but who said that this it was already starting conversations in their company about, you know, particularly on indicators where other companies did better, and it was sort of helping them to think about how they might do things differently. So that was kind of interesting. It's early days so far. Companies don't tend to want to react too quickly if they don't have to on stuff. I haven't seen a lot of companies getting quoted in the media on this, and I assume some journalists have been asking questions. I would note that Twitter, the day after the index was published, released a new page that they're calling their policy transparency page, in which they linked to a lot of resources we had found, but with some effort and difficulty in finding them, and they kind of just have now linked to them all on one page. Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see kind of over time, but frankly, and we had a lot of conversations with a lot of these companies, and one of the things I've emphasized to them, and which I emphasize to everybody, you know, our results here are not kind of tablets carved in stone coming down from the mount, you know, ranking digital rights pronounces you such and such. This is meant to be a framework for a conversation about what the best practices need to be and how we get there. And there are some indicators that I think reflect very well established kind of standards around good practice, some of the privacy indicators in particular. Some of the other indicators, you know, for instance, like terms of service, how should you be transparent about terms of service? Well, there's no transparency anyway, so it wasn't, you know, we could have almost kind of put any details in there and it didn't matter because there was no transparency. But at what level should the data be reported? In what way do we want to see transparency around terms of service? I think that requires a really long conversation and a really long process of figuring this out, you know, among stakeholders. And also like grievance mechanisms, that requires a real conversation. Nobody quite knows how to do that properly or well. And I think that's going to require, again, companies and stakeholders from all over the world, policymakers as well, sitting down and saying, okay, how do we do this in a way that's meaningful, that brings more accountability to the process? You know, because one of the other conversations I've had with a couple of companies is that, you know, particularly internet companies, but also telcos, ISPs are under more and more pressure to, stop terrorists from using their networks and, to stop hate speech and to stop this and to stop that, putting more and more pressure on their terms of service to police what users are doing. And companies are kind of struggling to figure out how to respond to this in a way that doesn't kind of then get them in trouble with the human rights community. And transparency may be one piece of what they need to really be latching onto, is that, yes, there are terms of service, yes, there's enforcement that needs to happen, but it needs to be accountable. There needs to be due process, there needs to be grievance. We need to know what's happening. It can't be a black box, and it can't be all privatized without any accountability whatsoever, any ability to hold anybody publicly responsible when abuses happen. So, how do we kind of use some of these transparency standards as a way to prevent enforcement from becoming just completely this mysterious thing that happens behind a curtain and nobody has any idea what's happening, and that's a big problem.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I had a question also about the methodology. If you could talk a little bit just about how you developed the indicators, if they were mostly based on the UN guidelines on business and human rights or on other standards, how if they were validated. You said you had feedback from companies, if they were validated by academics or other organizations. And then if I understand correctly, the indicators look at what policies exist, but if you have any way of getting at how they're implemented,
Right.
and if there's any gap between what's on paper and practice.
Cool. Those are really important questions. I'm going to answer the second question first, and then I'll show you kind of some of the resources we have on there that kind of, we documented our methodology development process in quite a lot of detail, and Natalie here from USC was helping us with that, and she'll be part of the discussion later. But with this index, with this methodology, we decided we had to figure out what it was we could actually measure across sort of a global field. And we decided to only focus on disclosure and publicly available information, recognizing that's not the whole picture at all, but recognizing that that's the first step. And I would say that this is really a floor, not a ceiling, right? Because if you want to hold companies accountable for what they're doing, first they have to tell you what they're doing, right? And then you can go and check and see whether they're actually doing what they're saying, what they've committed to doing. But if they've made no commitments and they've made no disclosures about what they're doing, then it's even harder to get to that next step. So what this index is, it really represents the beginning of the beginning rather than where we want to be, because where we want to be is we want companies disclosing what their we want them making commitments, we want them disclosing what their policies and practices are, and then we want to be able to verify that they're actually doing what they say and that they're actually having the impact that they intend. And so that fourth thing is not in here. That is, I think, as far as our team is concerned, difficult to do for a global project. I think what that's going to require is a distributed network of researchers and advocates around the world who are actually investigating at the ground level how these policies and practices are impacting users at the local level, because that's really where it hits the road. And so I think we really need that research and tracking happening sort of on the ground in various communities at least the national level, and beyond. But if we can at least get companies to disclose what they're doing, that will at least get us somewhere. And I think some of the companies, there are kind of two reasons why they might not disclose policies. One is that it just didn't occur to them that they have the policies, but it didn't occur to them that anybody wanted them to disclose it. Maybe three reasons. One is that they don't want to disclose their policies because they think users won't like them. And then the third is that they don't have policies. You know, so there's a problem with a lot of companies actually not having clear company-wide policies about how to handle third-party requests to take down content. And they don't have training on it, and it's kind of very ad hoc. You see that actually quite a bit in a lot of companies. And so they may not have actually taken the time to formulate a policy that they would want to put out publicly because it's still too kind of moving and squishy. So that's another problem. So at least forcing the companies to articulate their policies, articulate their practices, means that they've actually thought through what they're doing. And there are a lot of cases where companies haven't holistically thought through what they're doing and have not had kind of the board and the CEO really think about what this means. And articulating policies forces that to happen, because anything they make public, the whole company, you know, at the very top level has to sign off on it, rather than just kind of looking the other way and leaving it to, you know, employees over there to figure out how to take down content, you know, which I think happens in some companies. So disclosure is kind of the first step, but there's a long way to go after that. And then on the methodology, we have a couple of resources about the methodology. One is the methodology page on the index that's just right here, and that's kind of more practical about the process. We also have a link here in this menu on methodology development, which I already put up here, which is about how we came upon the methodology. And that was sort of a multi-step process where we started out in early 2013, where basically I and a couple of interns kind of basically put together a very, very rough outline of different categories of issues that people have brought up through the Global Network Initiative, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. We looked at how other indexes have been constructed, some of the best practices, you know, on indexes around labor rights, or you know, there's an access to medicines index that's very well respected. Oxfam behind the brands is looking at food companies, and so what are the things that make an index credible? And a lot of it had to do with being transparent and consulting with a lot of stakeholders. So we kind of took an initial kind of outline of sort of issues around privacy standards that have come, you know, of the OECD and out of various, you know, European data protection guidelines and academic studies around consumer privacy, and then again best practices around transparency reporting, around sort of the Global Network Initiative principles. There's been some other research done around how to apply the UN Guiding Principles to the ICT sector that was done by the Institutes for Human Rights and Business, and so we, you know, went through that. We did a consultation with a bunch of NGOs and investors and business and human rights experts at University of Pennsylvania in 2013. We took the feedback from that, created what we call the draft set of criteria, and then we actually did case studies where we took those draft criteria and just applied them to selected companies in different countries. So we had a researcher who was a country, and actually Internews helped support these case studies. So we had a researcher who was focusing on India, who looked at several companies in India and applied the indicators. And at that time, we hadn't decided whether it was going to be based on publicly available information or if it was going to be a company survey. And so basically, researchers in a range of different countries had so much difficulty getting companies to tell them anything about anything that we decided from that case study process that we'd have to base the index on publicly available information, because otherwise it would just be an index about which companies responded to the survey, which is different than, you know, an examination of something a bit more real. The case studies, the country case studies, helped us also get a sense of what was important to stakeholders in different parts of the world, what was important to measure, what could be measured on different companies in different places. We took what we learned from that, and we created the first draft of our methodology, of our indicators, We workshopped that at RightsCon and a couple other conferences. Then we redrafted it again. Then we redrafted that and did a pilot study in the fall of 2014 in conjunction with an investment research firm called Sustainalytics. Because it was a test methodology, we didn't release the results, the scores publicly, although we did produce a report about what we learned from the pilot study, and that report is online. And this page here on the website kind of goes through all the different consultations and kind of different research that we did to arrive at the methodology. And then after the pilot report, we did another revision. After getting more feedback, we did a bunch of meetings with stakeholders last spring to get more feedback on what we learned. We did another revision, and that's what this methodology turned out to be. So yeah, we tried to do a lot of consultation and really tried to build on standards that are familiar to people, rather than just off the back of the napkin, here's a small cabal of people and what they think is important, that we were really trying to draw on documents that are coming from a range of different communities. So with that, sort of we're now entering into the time for our kind of second block, but we can also be pretty flexible. So let's take a couple more comments or questions, and then we'll kind of segue into our advocacy brainstorm, and Alon will lead that. And I will sit down and stop talking. And
Do you want to maybe take a couple questions and you can answer them?
yeah, let's do that. I'll take 2 more questions, I'll answer them together, and then we'll segue into our advocacy brainstorm.
Hello,
Sounds
my question is regarding the low scoring companies. About after the release of this report, have the companies stayed or communicated with you, or had feedback with Ranking Digital Rights about the lowest scores and how they can manage to grow to have bigger numbers on next report?
Not yet, but we're hoping we may hear from companies in future. There was one company, I'm not going to say which one because it was a private communication, but one of the companies that was fairly low down, one of the people who we had originally sent, we had sent our notifications to multiple people in that company, but one of them said, I've been on leave for the last 6 months and I look forward to engaging with you in future, and sorry I missed the whole boat on this. But if it's only one person who's the only person who deals with these issues, then that's kind of too bad also. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to have conversations with some of the companies, and they're, again, we've certainly not gotten public communications to that effect, but hopefully some of them will be interested in talking. And, not necessarily to us, which kind of segues to the, I was going to take questions in batches and then I didn't. But anyway, but it kind of segues to the advocacy conversation a bit, which is that in many cases, it might be more effective for these companies not necessarily to talk to me, but so in the case of Bharti Airtel, maybe they should, maybe the best way to get Bharti to pay attention is to talk to stakeholders from India or stakeholders from other markets that are important to them. So this dialogue doesn't have to just be through some centralized source. I'm really hoping that this dialogue can happen with stakeholders all over the world. Because, again, the methodology is all there, and we're certainly happy to help provide context and help in terms of what it means to do better. Yeah. Oh, Jason had one. Oh, we have one there. Sorry, I'm going out of line. I should listen to Nell.
Good afternoon. I'm studying law for almost 1.5 years, and the biggest problem that I see is that sometimes people forget who are human rights made for.
Mm-hmm.
And do you think that is also a problem in this area? Because human rights are made for people.
Yep.
And
Exactly.
most people I know, even in my course, people who are studying law, medicine, or whatever, I'm not talking about people who doesn't have any knowledge, any education, but I'm talking about people that have a very good education. Many people I know don't know about
Yeah.
internet rights, or when I told them about this meeting, this forum, they didn't even know about.
Yeah.
And how can we protect rights that people don't know
Yeah.
that exist?
That's a real problem, and actually that speaks to this next session, which I think we should just segue into. But one of the things we found, especially with telcos, is that the companies are talking to regulators, so their disclosures are published in a language that regulators understand and in shorthand, and they sort of omit things in their disclosures that they know that regulators already know, and rather than talking to users about what's happening to their information or what's happening to their access. Their disclosure is just to kind of make the regulators happy, and that's a problem. You know, so in some cases when we talk to the companies, it's like, why didn't you disclose anything about how long you retain user data? And they're like, well, we're complying with regulations. They're like, so the user knows what that means? But they're like, well, we comply with regulations, why do we need to disclose it otherwise? Everybody knows what the regulations are. You know, which is a very so their audience is the regulators, not the users. And we found that in a lot of cases. And so, but I think, I know you have a hand, but do you think it relates to advocacy? So why don't we save that for the advocacy brainstorm, and Alan's just gonna sort of lead a discussion here so we can jump right into your comment. And I'm gonna sit down, but I'm happy to drive the website if you need me to show anything.
Can I just
Yeah.
just a last question? I have to leave and go to another
Sure.
session. So Nicolo Zingales from Terms of Service and Human Rights Project. We actually looked a lot to this project as an inspiration for what we are doing. We are just assessing terms of service, so it's a more narrow scope of the project. But I'm very interested in how actually you plan to assess the dynamics aspect of it. So companies are changing terms of service and policies all the time. So I'm wondering, first of all, if there will be a 2016 accountability index, and how do you assess if there are multiple changes within one
Yeah.
year, for example, and whether you're planning to expand the scope to other companies as well?
That's a good question. So I will answer that before we hand it over to Alan. So in terms of, the fact that companies are changing more than once a year, we do have a question in both the privacy and freedom of expression section about whether the company notifies users when they change terms of service and privacy policies, which kind of attempts to get to that, recognizing that we're just not able to do this research on, much more than a yearly schedule. I mean, just in terms of the, what it takes. Perhaps in the future, there may be some way to have a more dynamic approach to at least some of the indicators, but we'll need to kind of figure out how to do that. We haven't quite worked out how to do that in a way that would be consistent in terms of the information we're reporting. In terms of when will the next index be, I hope that this will be an annual project. I don't know if we'll have the funding to release an index next year. We would very much like to expand it to something closer to 30 companies. A lot of people are asking me, where is Apple, where is Samsung, where is Nokia Ericsson, where is, this, that, and the other. We wish we could, so I'm hoping that we have a graduate student named Tim Liebert who's kind of working on how do we expand the methodology to include equipment and software and hardware, devices and so on. How we would modify the methodology to include those types of companies. We're also working on the funding so that we can do a second index of any size. if we don't manage to do a second index in 2016, we hope that we'd be able to issue the second one by early 2017 and then go annual from there once we kind of work out how the project can be sustained in a more long-term fashion. But in some ways, if we have a little bit of time to consult and do more stakeholder engagement before we do the next one, that'll make sure that once we get into the annual cycle, it'll really be something that we really maximize people's ability to use, and not just in an NGO and investor side, but also for the companies to really kind of use it as a tool to improve. But I'm now handing it over to Alon, full stop.
Thanks, Rebecca. So in terms of what Rebecca was just saying, in terms of making sure that the ranking is actually used and that people can do something with it, obviously advocacy is really important for that. So we don't want to just put out numbers and say, well, these are the scores, okay, let's just, cross our fingers, hope that the world improves somehow. We really need to engage with lots of people, and that's why I'm really glad to see that so many of you are here today, to make sure that there's advocacy following on these results to push companies and to push governments where necessary to make sure that companies will do better in respecting their users' rights. So this next little session, this next little while, the next hour or so that we'll take here to talk about advocacy and partly also follow on research in certain areas, I'd really like to use to get your ideas, to brainstorm with us about how we can best do that. What sort of things do we want to highlight from just looking at the results, some of the things that Rebecca pointed out, or some things that you've seen on our website perhaps? What are the kind of things that really strike you as well? This is something that we need to push companies to improve on. And if you see those things, how would you like to push for that? Is there something that you can organize a campaign for in your country? Is it something that we should come together, build a coalition on to campaign about? There are all sorts of options. So I'd really like to hear your thoughts. I'm just going to start with giving the microphone, or maybe I can ask Natalie to give the microphone to Negat. So Negat can mention some of the ideas that she's had for Pakistan.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Rebecca, for such a wonderful presentation. I was part of the study, the phase 1, and I sort of reviewed that how the index sort of, can work for the companies who are working in Pakistan, internet companies and telecom companies. And we have been doing advocacy around internet freedom for the last couple of years in Pakistan, and we have seen that internet companies like Facebook and Twitter, they are responding to a lot of government's requests in taking down content and giving users information. But they really don't reveal that under what laws and legislation they are providing that information. I used to wonder that what kind of evidence we need to sort of give it to the companies, or asking government that what are the laws or what are the justification government gives to the companies to take down the data. And in case of Facebook, have been taking down a lot of pages and mostly political content, while the government, when send them requests, it always mentions under the anti-Islamic or blasphemy laws. And we always wonder that how political content comes into the blasphemy laws. And that's what we always question to the social media, social networks like Facebook and Twitter, and they really don't have answer to it. But I think now that we have an evidence, and I think the evidence-based advocacy would work for us now to question these internet companies, and also some of the methodologies we can also use to apply on the local telecom companies, because there is no human rights assessment work going on, especially when it comes to developing countries.
Right. And so, sorry, just to give Nugat one more chance to say something, I wanted to ask you, so in terms of applying such things locally for telecommunications companies in Pakistan, for example, do you have ideas of how to tackle that, and maybe ideas that others could also use?
I think we still need to work around that, because telecom companies really do not interact with users or the advocacy groups who are working in the country. But maybe, some campaigns while sharing the results of this research or the findings with these companies, and sort of let them know that the international companies are sort of following following these human rights assessment standards, so how the local companies can follow that. And maybe something, the research that Ranking Digital Rights did, something make similar at the local level. I don't know. I mean, I'm still listening. I'm waiting to hear from others. The ideas how they are going to implement that in their own countries.
Thank you. Courtney?
Courtney Radge, I'm the Advocacy Director at the Committee to Protect Journalists. A couple of ideas and comments. First of all, I think it's imperative to know if it's going to be an annual report, because as a one-off report, I think there will be limited, advocacy potential. Having worked at other organizations that do an annual ranking of countries on press freedom and internet freedom, et cetera, it really does become something where countries come to you and want to improve their scores, and so you could see the same thing happening with companies. So I think, figuring that out is really critical to making,
Yeah, if I could just interject, I'm going around with my begging bowl.
Well, I'm sure there are lots of
it's
governments.
imperative,
Yeah.
I myself am not a billionaire, so therefore we have to get funding from elsewhere. And I agree, it would be great if I could tell you today that it's going to be an annual ranking, but I'm just not physically able to do so.
Right, but it's not you. You're in a room full of people who are part of networks.
Right.
There
Yeah,
are definitely
so-
donor agencies in
So
this
hopefully we
room.
can find a way.
Yeah, I mean, I think crowdsourced funding, there are a lot of individual users, I think, who would have a great interest in putting in $5, to some sort of crowdfunding campaign that would help this happen, because without these sort of, as you said, you can't even find these policies. So that's one idea. I think another question about taking it to the local level, which is really critical, and so that you get the regional diversity, is whether you've looked at about the possibility of training local organizations, not necessarily you, but local organizations being able to adopt the methodology the way that UNESCO does with its media development indicators or its journalist safety indicators, which is a methodology that allows someone to conduct that assessment. And it's from what I know of this index, it seems like something that people could do, organizations could do locally. So is there then a way to bring back that experience? If if Nagat's organization decides, okay, we're gonna do this for 3 companies in our country, and then is there a way then to feed back what they learn? Is there a way to validate results, et cetera? So I think that's maybe something to think about. And then just in terms of some of the issues that are raised here and what we see on the international agenda in terms of the whole countering violent extremism agenda, I think that this is more and more important, because there's also this acquiescence by large parts of the public to having social media firms and internet platforms making the decision about what content should or should not be allowed, the opaqueness of what is said. I was just at an OSCE meeting in Romania where the Facebook representative said, the definition of what we consider terrorism is in our terms of service, and said it does not apply, it's not the U.S. definition. And then I went to the terms of service and it's not there. So, even I think officials don't necessarily know what their policies are or not. And of course, with most of these global fora, we see, the definitions of terrorism or extremism are defined by, the global superpowers, and those with greater power. And so what sort of, broader implications does that have?
Thanks, Courtney. And there's a question here or suggestion here to the front.
Thanks. I'm Frane Marojevic. I work for the OSCE on freedom of the media issues. So I find this report extremely useful and stimulating, because actually, just the same way as David said, we're all coming around to the same issues, that freedom of expression is being also possibly limited by these large companies, which are essentially outside government control. As a intergovernmental organization, our main focus is on governments, and I found it very interesting when you said that, or you indicated that some of the companies behaved better when the laws forced them. So I would be interested to know if there was some way of correlating that, because that's something that we are trying to do as an organization, force governments to behave better, and then force governments not to force companies into doing this. And that's also the issue when it comes to stopping terrorism and fighting terrorism. We also don't think this is something that should be left in the realm of private corporations and companies. They should not be the ones who are defining what is permissible in terms of terrorism, what is hate speech. This is for governments, because the governments have to respect international legal obligations that have signed up to, and they are accountable to the citizens, but also to the wider international community. So also transparency, I think what your report points out, is extremely helpful in this case, so we can also chase up, again, governments, so they cannot hide. There cannot be a ping pong between governments and companies. Who is to blame? It then becomes much more clear and much better to say who it is, who is doing the limiting and who is doing the shutting down. So in terms of enforcement mechanism, I think there are plenty of those out there. Just we need reports like that are extremely helpful. So thank you.
Thank you. Maybe if you could pass the microphone to your neighbor, Peter Majcek with Access, who's been one of the research partners to get to where we are. So, Peter, I'd really love to hear some of your thoughts, and from looking at the findings and from looking at the results, and what kind of advocacy approaches do you see are possible to take this on with?
Thank you. Just want to say that Access Now is really a big supporter of ranking digital rights, and are very glad to see these results. I think we see, though, the big need for improvements, but see also that this does provide a roadmap for those ways that companies can, of their own initiative, better respect digital rights. So I think we see the need to reach out to all stakeholders involved in corporate governance, using the machinery of the corporation itself in some cases. So we plan to write to the boards of the companies that were ranked to ask the board members to understand that digital rights is now a board level issue, that they need to hold their own officers to account for these results. We plan to attend the AGM meetings where individual investors attend and have the chance to question the board and the officers, to show that there is a groundswell of support for better security, better corporate governance, and attention to these issues. Finally, I think we want to see ways that individual users can access corporate remedy mechanisms. That's one of the major gaps that this report reveals, is that there's really no way for individual users, customers or not, to complain that their human rights are being violated, perhaps with the corporation's help. So we want to use those mechanisms that exist and strengthen the opportunities for users.
Thank you. So we heard options of going to annual general meetings of companies, doing local research, local campaigning. Are there other thoughts or ideas that people want to build further on that you've heard or that you want to raise as we're talking about advocacy approaches here?
Becky, you have
Is this working? Hi, I'm Becky Lentz from McGill University, and I'm studying and teaching digital rights advocacy and trying to find some research partnerships. And I was curious the extent to which you have engaged the universities or some kind of consortia of universities that might actually be able to help sustain some of the research, and that's a possibility maybe to think about how the academic side could help support that. And not just, I'm talking internationally, right, because there's several. But I was also curious to know in what ways you might have engaged the consumer rights groups already, in terms of, like, Consumers International at one point had some of this on their agenda in various ways, but they've since dropped it. And I was curious if you've had any chance to talk to them. And also, I was curious what level of people you're talking to in these companies. Is it the people in, which divisions are the people that are being most responsive? And are the public affairs side and the governmental relations people, I mean, who are the people that what divisions? I mean, corporations are big places, right? So that's one of the questions. And the other is, response from the FCC? Any kind of indications of their support or responses to it, at least in the U.S. context? And then, what extent do you think the employees, not just the people in the boardroom, but just the ordinary people working in these places, actually know what digital rights are, and that there's anything that they're doing that has anything to do with this kind of stuff, as opposed to, in other words, just not simply an oppositional agenda and an account of, a monitoring and blame game, but also trying to find ways to connect and educate and do literacy stuff. So.
Thank you. I think I heard maybe 6 questions. Rick, I don't know if you have time to cover all of them, but maybe 2. No. They're all very good questions. But
yeah, I regarding Consumer International, I have had some initial conversations with them, and so now that the index is actually out, we're going to try and figure out ways to. There's a number of groups, also a number of kind of shareholder advocacy groups and so on that we're starting to have conversations with, and hopefully over the coming months we'll kind of come up with some more concrete activities. Part of our problem with being understaffed is that while we were actually getting the index out, that we were limited in terms of some of the other outreach. Universities, that would be great. Sort of early on, we had a lot of support from University of Pennsylvania, several parts of that university. We haven't succeeded in finding an academic home, which is probably fodder for a conversation more privately as to why. But we have been working with individual academics all over the world in doing this research. And so individual academics from a whole range of countries have participated in research throughout the project. But we found so far it's been easier to engage individual academics, and particularly graduate students who find that their advisors and kind of more senior parts of the university don't really get their research interests and kind of have an outlet for their interests in working with us. That's also been sort of, we found sort of a gold mine of such people.
I have no idea who you might be talking about.
You're right, yeah, Natalie being one of them. Universities are interesting because this project doesn't fit in any particular, in anybody's specific silo in terms of academic topics. So sometimes it's a little difficult to figure out how to navigate that. But there's a longer, very academic-y, wonky conversation about the nature of universities that is probably better had over beer. But we would love to find more of an academic home or a set of academic homes or kind of more formal academic partners. That would be wonderful if we could figure out how to do that. Because I myself am not a professor, it's been a little harder to do than it might have been if I were. But on some of the other questions, who we're engaging at companies, it varies from company to company who has responsibility for these types of issues. In many cases, we've dealt with, so for companies that are members of the Global Network Initiative and Industry Dialogue, they actually have point people who kind of work on these issues. And sometimes, so in the case of Yahoo, they have a business and human rights program, and so the people in that program are your interlocutors, and then they reach out to colleagues in specific, privacy-related things or terms of, depending on what the specific issue is, they then know who to reach out to in their companies to follow up. On the telco side, beyond that, it's been harder to figure out kind of who to deal with. Because there's no kind of, there are sometimes sort of people handling privacy, but then there are the investor relations people, then there are the policy people, and so we often found ourselves reaching out to people in multiple departments and seeing whether anybody was going to respond, and also just asking other NGOs and allies who may have had contacts within these companies, who do we contact? So oftentimes it was very specific and personalized and didn't translate from company to company very well. But that again is, I think, a real challenge for advocacy is who's your first point of contact for these conversations? And if it's not one of the companies that sends representatives to conferences like this, it's really hard to know. And that in itself, if we can just get a toehold in that regard would be helpful. Yeah, FCC in the U.S., I mean, I know some people, I've met some people, but because this is a more global focus rather than kind of a U.S. legal focus, that hasn't so far been as much of a focus of our engagement. But I certainly hope that some of our allied and related groups and organizations that we work with perhaps can take the lead on that. And, you know, which brings me to sort of the whole question of engaging with regulators everywhere. And I was talking to a group of African NGOs this morning, and people were bringing up, you know, there's some real conversations to be had with regulators. And I think that it's probably the best people to sort of organize those conversations are not Ranking Digital Rights, but the local groups that have, you know, some existing relationship in talking to regulators in specific countries. And, you know, then we'd be happy to contribute to that conversation with our research and so on. But so there may well be sort of a consortium of groups that kind of get together and talk to regulators in different countries. Maybe there's some kind of convening around an internet governance related thing. You know, maybe regional IGFs might be a good platform to have conversations with regulators on these issues, in addition to the usual kind of, you know, internet governance issues, and to bring some of these issues more into the agenda in places where the regulators tend to show up. So I think it'll be really interesting to kind of talk to our friends and allies about just how to have those conversations, what those conversations need to look like, what the asks to regulators are. Because oftentimes the regulations are just not clear about what companies can and cannot disclose without getting in trouble. And so that's definitely, and somebody else mentioned too, just about laws, positive or negative effects. Yeah, I mean, there are some cases where we saw particularly data protection laws having positive effects on company practice, but we also saw a lot of cases where law was preventing companies from disclosing, or even in the cases like the UK, there's disagreement about what the law allows Vodafone to disclose on both takedown requests and data sharing requests. And so I think there are a lot of conversations that need to be had with regulators about, look, you know, what are you gaining by allowing this kind of obscurity and opaqueness? If you purport to be a democratic government and you've signed on to the Open Government Partnership and, you know, et cetera, come on, guys. You know, so there's definitely a lot of conversations to be had with friends and allies and regulators around the world, and with companies too, because I do sense that in some places that some of the companies would like to have regulators be more clear about what they can do and allow them to be more transparent, and might be willing to participate in some of these conversations, especially if they're not always public conversations, but some of the kind of more difficult closed-door conversations that maybe need to be had with some of these regulators. And so what platforms do we use to facilitate these conversations, I think is a really, really good question. And so, you know, I definitely look forward to suggestions from everybody in the room about just how we can assist these conversations with our data and information. But I don't think we necessarily need to lead them. I think oftentimes the conversations are best led by the stakeholders in the countries concerned. But we want to assist as much as we can.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Back to Alan.
I'd like to give the microphone to Donnie BU. Donnie, you've been very helpful with our research in Southeast Asia in particular, and focusing on Axiata in Malaysia. But in the country in which you work, Indonesia, what sort of ways do you think you could do advocacy on these issues to make companies do better, to improve their practices?
Yes, thank you, Alan. So, first of all, when I'm not so surprised when the Axiata has a very low positions on the report. I want to put a context first, because Axiata is a parent company, which is they have two subsidiaries, one in Malaysia, Celcoms, and the others XL Axiata in Indonesia. When I did the research about both of those companies, there's a difference, very difference between two companies, although they are the same parents. If the Axiata only Axiata point is only generated from the Celcoms, I believe that the Axiata position should be a little bit higher. Why? Because when I did a research of indicator by indicators, it's clearly seen that the Celcom in the Malaysia is more comply with the protections of data protections, more comply with some of the data retention regulations, rather than is partners their partners in Indonesia. And when I learned more about the context, then I found that in Malaysia they already had a data protection law since 2010, and some of significant indicators that I found on the Celcom in Malaysia, it's pretty much related to the regulations of Malaysia. But in Indonesia, we don't have yet that kind of regulations of data protection. And so there, all of the telco company in Indonesia, they don't bother to put any informations on their website, on their printed materials, about the rights of the consumers on the protection, on the privacy. Although, and this is another information. 1 month after I finished my duty on the research, I had a chance to discuss. I had to meet the CEO of the XL Axiata, and we talk informally, and I start to persuade her, and I told her, why don't you put the information on your website about the protection rights of the consumer? And she said, is it really needed? So this is like the ecosystem of the environment of the law of the country, which can be also reflected on this report. So the report is very much important to do advocacy for civil society, but this is also a question from me, maybe to Rebecca or to Mr. K. Which one should the civil society engage? Should we engage with the governments and bring this report and say, governments, because you don't have this kind of regulation, then the company or the corporate, they not comply with the protections of human rights or whatsoever. Or civil society can engage with the private sector and say, you know what, you're very low on indicator. Why don't you push your governments to have these regulations, and then you can higher ranking? Please don't answer that both is okay, because we have very limited, civil society have very limited resources, and also maybe, I don't know which one is right to connect with, engage with governments. I know there's multi-stakeholders, I know the IGF, but which one should be better, connect with the governments or connect with the private sector, which is both can be done, but which one is politically correct? Thank you, Alan.
Thanks very much, Donnie. Both are important, obviously. I'm actually curious if, Natalie, if you could leave the microphone with Donnie for just 1 second. So you said that you had a chance to engage with the CEO of a big telecommunications company in Indonesia, and I think that is an opportunity that is really great that probably a lot of civil society organizations in many countries don't get. Right? So how do you advise it? Did you find that to be fruitful? Did you find it to be a useful venue?
This one?
to talk to the CEO
Oh,
of
yes.
Excel? And if so, how can people in other countries get in touch in such a way that they can actually engage with the company on these issues?
Well, yes, of course, because actually the awareness of the privacy in Indonesia is still low. In the people in Indonesia is still low. The privacy is still low. But when why I can have engaged with the CEO of the Excel is because I was a journalist at that time, and I know some of the contact persons, and some of when you write something right, then you got reputation and integrity. Then when they need advice, and they will call you and sit together with you and discuss it. So I pretty much happy with this result. And when I back to IGF, maybe I will arrange a meeting with this CEO and bring this document, and I will push her that, you know what, the Axiata as a parent is get a low ranking because of you. Then you have to change your company to be compliant and put it on the website, the information. So maybe that's the way that I will do it. One of the advocacy things.
Thanks very much. In this case, I should clarify that for the research, for the rating that Axiata received, the Indonesian subsidiary was not incorporated into this score. But obviously, Axiata's overall policies do affect the subsidiary as well. So that makes a lot of sense.
I'm wondering if we could throw Donnie's question back to the group a bit more, because I think this is I don't know if this mic is working, I'll use this one. I think it's a key question, what is the role of regulation here versus what is the role of pushing companies, do we have to wait for the right regulations to be passed, or how much room is there to push companies to improve with or without the right regulation, and kind of what is the balance there for advocacy? Maybe it's different in different countries, but I would love to hear people's views on that, because we'd love to kind of be able to help both kinds of advocacy in whatever strategy people think is most effective. Eduardo?
Hi, I'm Eduardo Bertoni from Argentina. It's an interesting question because today I attended other panel this morning about the Internet Bill of Rights in Italy and the Marco Civil, and I asked a similar question about implementation and legislation itself. Okay, it's a similar question. It's not exactly the same. My question there was, okay, if the trend is to go in the similar path of Italy or Brazil, that means having a comprehensive law. Is that enough? Because people are saying now that the problem is the implementation of the Marco Civil, for example, some part of the implementation of the Marco Civil. And the discussion was very interesting. Implementation is something that we have to have in mind when we are, drafting legislation. In this case, regulation vis-a-vis, I would say the code, or in the now is the old-fashioned way, but in the way that companies are doing their things. Technology is evolving too fast. So sometimes regulations, or I would say that maybe regulations will always be behind this technology change. So if it is possible to choose for a strategy, maybe it's better to convince technology that the technology sector, the business sector, that it's much better to know that there are minimum standards that they have to comply always when they are developing new, technology. I don't know if that is feasible or not, but again, it's in relation to your question, Rebecca, or Donnie's question. It's better to, wait for the regulation and then say the companies, okay, you have to comply with this regulation. Maybe the regulation is old in the moment that they have to comply. So it's a vicious circle. So we need to transform this vicious circle in a virtuous circle. And the virtuous circles might be maybe having some standards, benchmarks, something like the Raji principles, or something that some people are thinking in develop very soon, having this benchmark and say, okay, you should follow those benchmarks. I mean, it's much better if there is a law, if there is a regulation, but if you don't have it, you have to follow this because there are other principles that you have to follow, that there are human rights principles. Maybe it's a very confusing comment, but I don't have an answer of that. But I think that the question is something that we need to have in mind when we are thinking in regulation or the code.
Well, I have a follow-up question for you on this, because it would be, and also it would be interesting to hear people's thoughts, and maybe David's thoughts as well, in terms of, what are the standards, the principles. And in a way, that's sort of what we tried to do with our indicators, is that these are sort of the core questions, that are built around principles for what companies should be doing. And I guess I'd point out that in addition to sort of looking at the results and the indicators there, if you go to the download page, which you get through that menu there, and you go to download, and then you come here, you can just get our list of indicators without all the company results added. And these are the indicators that we released when we started the research. But it goes sort of question by question about, sorry, I'm just forwarding through like the explanation here. Yeah, so starting with the C section, the question by question, here is what we're looking for the company to do. I guess one question is I'd be just interested in people's reactions, maybe today, maybe later, once you have a chance to kind of go through each of the indicator questions. Is there a foundation here for some standards in these indicators? Or, how can, I guess the question is, from your perspective, from the perspective of the people in the room, do these indicators provide something that we could build kind of broader standards off of? I mean, we're drawing from also things like the 13 principles and the Manila principles, and we're citing all of those types of principles, which are more for government policy. But what we're trying to do here is for company behavior or company practice and policy. But I guess to what extent, I'd be interested to hear, again, over time, if not today, just to what extent people feel that the indicators we're using might provide a framework for kind of much broader expectations for company policy and practice. But I don't know if anybody has any thoughts.
Well, it's like, I'm thinking aloud now, but I think that, let's put it in this way, this ranking should be in a dialogue with principles. I mean, I'm not seeing this project as principles. I'm seeing this project, this is pretty obvious, but I'm seeing this project in some way as the old-fashioned ways in advocating for human rights. That means naming and shaming. Okay, so we have the principles. Because you're not following with these principles, you are ranked in this way here. So it should be a dialogue there. But the problem that you raise is, okay, yes, I agree with that, but who set the principles? Right. What are the principles? And that comes to the other problem, because in some situation, it's hard to say exactly what are the principles. We can mention very broad principles, but very broad principles are subject to interpretation. So we can interpret it interpret the principles in one way, the companies are interpreting the principles in another way, the governments are interpreting principles in the third way, so that is complicated. In terms of principles, we have, you mentioned the GNI principle, so there are some principles over there that we can use to rank, but it will be interesting to say, okay, those are the principles, this is a problem, but your project, this project, should be in a dialogue with those principles, but it's not the goal of the ranking to set the principles.
Right.
You know, I don't know if it is clear what I'm saying.
Yeah, that makes sense. We've got Luis.
Well, first, congratulations. Many of us have been expecting for this to see it like materialize, and it's awesome. And I would just want a brief reflection. Here in Mexico, we have a similar effort, more narrow, that's called ¿Quién defiende tus datos? Who defends your data? It's focused on telecommunication companies and only on privacy. And I think the case for companies to respect human rights, although I agree, and the companies that we have had conversations with, they are defensive and say, who's requiring me to do this? And they always go like, but why are you asking me to do things that are not required by law? And you have to make the case for beyond compliance effort. And I think that there's ways in which you can make them, you can incentivize them to adopt beyond compliance effort. And I think one of them is that companies don't like to be regulated. For example, especially internet companies. I mean, telecommunication companies have been regulated before, and they have, and this is bad because they have already a regulatory relationship with the telecommunication regulator, which makes them, what you said, like very regulator-oriented in their policies, and they just feel that they only need to be accountable to the regulator. Internet companies really would not like, I'm pretty sure, would not like regulators around the world regulating them. So by adopting beyond compliance, I mean, the case you can make, and I've seen that it can work, and it has worked in other business sectors, is that you incentivize them to adopt these efforts so they avoid, they disincentivize countries or regulators to regulate them. So by anticipating and recognizing the, I agree with that, with Eduardo, and probably that's something that needs to be worked on, especially since now there are many efforts, similar efforts, and maybe we might have different standards, and so a company might be confused about why is RDR requiring me this and you are requiring me something different. And probably something can be worked out, although I think they are all around the framework, the rugged rules, and the work that's been done, and GNI, and also in Europe, there's been an implementation of the rugged rules on ICT companies. So I mean, I think there's an informal dialogue among all these standards that have been becoming more and more concrete, but I think there's ways in which you can make the case for beyond compliance standards and not just wait for this to become a law. But also we need to take into account the nature of the company and the context, the operating context, etc. But well, I just wanted to make a point about beyond compliance as not something that is doomed, but that has a way to be convincing for companies, and that of course this is a very short-lived field that needs more developing, and I think dialogue among us is very important.
That's really helpful.
Thank you. Any other thoughts, ideas that people have?
I don't even need the mic. So, well, two thoughts, and like Eduardo's sort of thinking aloud to a certain extent, although we've probably all been thinking about these kinds of issues. So I think one thing that is important is to internationalize the principles in some, or, well, you got to get to principles, but internationalize in a way that corporate actors have more than a civil society project and more than the very soft law of a rapporteur's report. So, I mean, I think the direction that, at least that I would want to head is to, in a way, abstract out from RDR and other projects the core principles and find a way to get the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly ultimately to adopt them. That still is a kind of soft law, but it is what happened with the Ruggie principles. And one of the things that we're trying to do now is to essentially reverse engineer the Ruggie principles so we can see, well, how did they get to a place which, in retrospect, it may look, oh yeah, of course they were going to end up with these principles on business and human rights, but it was, it took a good 8-9 years to get there. So I think that's an important goal, is to get them embedded into some kind of recognized document. I mean, the problem with that, of course, is you tend to water down some of the more important principles, but it can be a long process. The other thing I think is to remember examples of both successful and, to the corporate sector, scary examples around business and human rights. And there are tools out there, and I mean, I think anybody looking at, from a corporate perspective, looking at Europe, allowing courts alone to deal with some of these issues is quite scary. We could rattle off some of the recent cases in Europe that I think has put the corporate sector on notice to a certain extent. And I think that it's the beginning, and the future could be much scarier for governments or for corporate actors, and if they don't sort of get ahead of the curve. And so, I mean, I think looking at things like the way the extractive industry has been regulated, which involved both sort of the naming and shaming, as Eduardo mentioned, but it also actually include litigation. Those kinds of tools, I think, should be available to users in this space. And I don't think that's where corporate actors want this to head. So to a certain extent, they need to be reminded, I think, that, I'm sounding like out of a movie from the 70s, but they have two choices, right? They can go the easy route, which is to get ahead now, or they can go a more dangerous route, which I think is likely to happen if they don't, take steps to adopt the kinds of principles that Ranking Digital Rights suggests they should be taking. And they're just throwing a couple of those things out there as ideas.
Thank you.
That all sounded really great, David. Hi, Kevin Bankson, Open Technology Institute. Full disclosure, we are lucky and proud enough to be the platform on which Rebecca has built this independent project, and it's really awesome. I'm thinking about how we can get change from the companies based on this report. I'm imagining something along the lines of short, as Peter maybe mentioned, letters or even sort of joint reports with specific joint reports from a variety of civil society actors to the companies, making specific recommendations tailored to each company on how they can improve their score and appeal to their competitive interest. And so I've been just sort of looking at the results and thinking about what would be sort of the top line messages for each of the companies, recognizing that the overall average scores don't shed an enormous amount of light. We should be looking at the individual indicators, but at the same time, most people are going to start with where they are in the overall rankings. And so I was just thinking how I would approach each of the companies individually if I were talking to them, and just thought I'd share that. I think with Google, which is pretty much the leader on everything except for its, a few points less on commitment. I think the message to them is you are and have been the leader on a lot of these things, and you should keep that position by innovating new best practices to raise everybody's game, perhaps starting with being the first to report on terms of service-based takedowns, like you were the first to report on most other categories of information. I think Yahoo and Microsoft, there's a message to them, which is your institutional commitment is very strong, but your practices don't bear it out. So put your money where your mouth is, or walk the walk. Actually live up to the commitments you've made and enhance your practices. It seems the message to Twitter is the reverse of that, which is your practices are pretty strong, relative, recognizing that everyone got a failing grade, But relative to the others, your practices are strong, but your institutional commitment is not. Make your commitment match what you're doing. And then Facebook, I don't know what to do. I mean, Facebook, it's like, guys, come on. You're last on freedom of expression, on privacy, and you're second to last on commitment. And although we appreciate your hard work on, I guess there are a few indicators they're best on, maybe.
If I could make a comment on Facebook too, I mean, we looked at the corporate entity. So for internet companies, we looked at several services.
WhatsApp, yeah.
WhatsApp and Instagram, their policies and their disclosures are much, much weaker than for Facebook, the social network. And given that WhatsApp has 900 million users and Instagram is, I forget it, I think it's like 600 million, or I forget exactly, but I know that WhatsApp is 900 million. You know, that's non-trivial. There are users all over the world that, you know, they have responsibility for the rights of those users, not just the Facebook network. They need to be consistent in deploying their policies and, you know, being as transparent across the different services. And so, you know, if their policies and practices have been as strong on Instagram and WhatsApp, they would have fared better, but they're very, very inconsistent. And sometimes they just weren't clear, you know, about what applied to what. And so in cases where companies were not clear about what was applying to what service, under what circumstances, you know, when in doubt, you don't count it, right? Because it's not clear. So there was a lot of that really hurt their score.
And so that would be a good targeted message to bring to them as well. So anyway, just sharing some ideas.
These are all great. Thanks very much, Kevin. I think next we're going to segue into Natalie's section, which is going to focus a bit more on the research side of things and how other research projects can build on the research that we've done. And we can still talk about advocacy. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap between research and advocacy. But I think we're also hitting
Let
over...
people take a little
Yeah,
break.
exactly. We're hitting 2 hours into the session. It would be great if you can come back energized. So, you know, there are fridges of water outside. And if you want to come back in a few minutes and re-engage with us on these issues, I'd be really thrilled.
And we're conveniently across from the bathroom.
That's right.
So, yeah, if we give ourselves 10 minutes.
Thanks.
Oh, great comments. The ranking and dialogue principles. That sounds exactly right.
Well, at least I went home after 5 hours at the airport in DC. I just went home. They wanted to fly me to Miami.
Everything's good. Everything's good with you? Yeah, I'm now with the Indonesian MCIT people. Unfortunately, the minister cannot come, but some of the high rank officers.
Wait, so which do you work with? MCIT.
Yeah,
That's interesting. So you're an official. Now you're very official.
And because we are, and all this kind of so like for example, like tonight we like meeting the
This one to like break the knee.
the Indonesian for tomorrow on the
No, I meant they
they can
Where you were with, what was the
I think that'd be helpful. I don't know.
Yeah, it was ICT, right? So ICT, are you still with ICT Watch? So ICT, okay, so you're with both. Basically, you're like a member of the public delegation.
Well, no.
Right, great to see you. Yeah, for sure.
Obviously, the delegation is not
I see.
but because we are working very closely.
I see. When you go back home, you're not.
They also lost
No. Yeah.
But the thing is,
Yeah.
I think to meet with to have informal discussion. One day before I went to update about what the idea.
So hi guys. These are my students.
Actually, to me,
The first one was, but only in risk
I mean, he
assessment,
doesn't. He just
not
had
overall.
No, Yahoo was second overall.
Yes, yes. It is more interesting to talk about it at first place, so we can go further than just principles at a time.
It's an interesting way. Yeah, they never seem to quite
People from CTS to see how this project is going, and then talk. Okay. Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Advocacy for focused research and research-based advocacy. So it's hard to completely separate the two. But I really want to touch back on some of the really great questions that Becky asked. I know that Irene, who's here from the University of Toronto, had something that she wanted me to bring up, but I haven't slept in 2 days, so I think it's better if she speaks for herself rather than me speaking for her. But I'll lend you my mic.
Thank you, Natalie, and congratulations for the great report. So talking about research, what came to mind is obviously the Access My Information tool that we developed. And the purpose of the tool, so it's a tool available online that currently only available in Canada, but we're in the process of localizing it so that it's available everywhere else. And the purpose of the tool is to allow customers of telecom companies to be able to request data on how, to request information on how their data is being used. We're currently trying, like I said, we're currently trying to expand the tool to other jurisdictions, not just Canada, but also hopefully in Asia. And we're trying to do comparative research between countries that have personal data privacy laws and those who don't. So for instance, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines. Kelly is also involved because we're doing the same kind of research in Korea. And I thought that I see a lot of parallels between that research that we're doing and the one that you guys are doing. So I thought I should mention it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Irene. So the project up until now has generated a lot of data. I'm a PhD student at the University of Southern California, and I've been involved with a number of research projects over the years, and this is probably the most data-intensive and rigorous in terms of data collection and verification and multiple reviews of everything, checking that all the criteria were done in a uniform way across the bar. I mean, this is, I think this would really stand up to any kind of peer review process. I mean, certainly I've seen published things that don't rise to this level of, I feel like I'm getting some knowing looks. But there's a lot more information that we could have out there, and there's also more things with the data that we already have that could be done. So that's kind of two parallel tracks that I'd like to take this conversation down. So one is what are additional data points that academic researchers and other researchers can add to the set of data that we have. And then separately, since Alan so meticulously compiled this wonderful CSV file that has all of the raw scores and raw data for all 16 of the companies across 31 indicators, and that's mental math that I can't do anymore, 16 by 31. So that's a lot of data points. So there's a lot of really interesting correlations, or who knows, maybe even some fancier stats than that we could do on that. But I'm curious if anybody here has some ideas on one of those two lines, doing more with this data or getting more data points.
Okay, well, thank you. Again, I'm Eduardo Bertoni from CELE, which is an academic research center based in Palermo University in Argentina. I have some, comments about future research projects that could be triggered by this research. But let me start with a general comment that is related to something that was said in the first part of this section, this meeting, which is talking about in general about human rights violation and who is accountable for human rights violation. In the old-fashioned, tradition and the wrong tradition, the only, human rights violators were the states. Now we are not talking about no, we are not saying that the only human rights violator might be or should be the states, but also the non-state actors. There's a lot of jurisprudence at the international level that include non-state actors that trigger state responsibility for human rights violations. And exactly at that point came this project, because this project is pointed the finger to some sort of possible human rights violations that are coming from non-state actors, meaning companies, the business sector. So this project is useful, this research is useful, in that area, in pointed out that there are some violations that are not coming specifically from state activity, but also from non-state activities. But still, states have a responsibility there. And again, this project is very useful because if states, governments know that the non-state actor could continue committing human rights violations, governments should do something. If not, they are going to be responsible. So this project could be very important also for governments, because if they don't want to be responsible for human rights violations committed by non-state actors, they should do something to correct that situation. This is a very, provocative idea, because whenever we think about regulations coming from government, some people are very scared about that or don't like this idea. But I mean, we are in this kind of situation where this project shows that there are problems in terms of human rights respect coming from non-state actors, and now this is public. I mean, so government should do something. So this is one possibility to do something in terms of studying the reaction of governments with this kind of projects. In terms of future, or what else could be built on this project, I would say that, and Rebecca mentioned before, this is the beginning, because it's obvious that what we need now is to know more than what is published by the company. We need to know the actual practices of the company. And this, as far as I understood, this research originally, or the first step of this research, was not committed to investigate the things that are ongoing, or the real things the real things that companies are doing. The idea was to see, okay, what is your policy? My policy is this. Well, if your policy is this, you're not complying with human rights. That means a lot. Of course, the actual situation could be worse or much worse, and could be changed the ranking of the companies. But if we think that what the companies, the business sector is saying is against some human rights principles, that means a lot. And I think that we can dig in this research in different areas, particularly the two general areas, freedom of expression and privacy. But in freedom of expression, for example, in terms of intermediary liability and removal, it's not exactly the same, I know, but content removal. So what are concrete practices that companies are doing right now? This is something that we don't have a research, I think. There are some things that are there, for example, well, actually we published a paper last year expressing our concerns of what some platforms have been doing in the case of Ecuador, removing content that was political, what we call political content, that the base of the removal was infringement of copyrights and so on and so forth. But what's going on in the real world in terms of content removal could be linked to this project. And in terms of privacy, and I will finish with this, in terms of new research or future research on privacy issues, this project cannot, or this ranking or whatever, this project, whatever the name, this project can, for me, is not useful to define the content of privacy, what privacy is. But it is useful to see some of the privacy problems that almost everybody agree. And this is very interesting because, for example, there are problems that affect privacy in the collecting process. There are problems that affect privacy in the distribution of collecting data. I mean, in the distribution of data. So I think that the future, research or next research could be, again, real, actual practices, actual, activities that companies are doing, and most important, if at least they are following their own principles or their own guidelines, yes or no. And I think that this is something that someone else or even this project could develop in the future. Those are my ideas.
Thanks, Eduardo. Does anybody have a comment or a follow-up on that? Great, thank you. And if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself just briefly, that'd be great.
All right. I'm Javier Paliero from Access Now. And just to elaborate a bit on what Eduardo said, I totally agree that probably a next step for this research would be just to check on how the companies are doing things for real beyond their policy position. But I guess that presents several problems. For instance, we've known that some companies like Twitter have different standards to the application of their policy in different countries, right? So doing a follow-up on that would demand for us to have people doing the research, or at least collecting the data in a lot of countries from different points of view, and that's just one company, right? So I guess that this report can probably be also a tool for user engagement and for user education, so the users can know which are the rights that are being harmed. And they can also somehow collect information on how they denounce this to their companies or to the companies that they use, and how the companies track those complaints, right? Because that could be probably a way of kind of crowdsourcing the collection of that information, right? That's it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think any researcher at some point in their life starts to fantasize about all the cool things they would research if they had unlimited research assistants and unlimited money to pay them. And two of the things that I fantasize about in this way related to this project is, one, if rather than ranking a bunch of companies that don't really compete directly with one another, So I'm from France originally. I'm really glad that Orange is in there because the situation in France is deteriorating rapidly with respect to digital rights. But how much more powerful would it be if we were ranking Orange not against Vodafone and AT&T, that they don't have any, they don't share any markets with, to my knowledge, but against SFR and Bouygues Telecom, right? So that's one way that I would love to see this database expanded. The other way is exactly what you just said. To look at how companies are operating differently, or maybe not, but probably differently in different markets. You pointed out Twitter. We know that Twitter behaves very differently in Turkey than it does in the UK, than it does in Canada. That's true of all of the other companies that are out there, and that's definitely something that we would love to see. It would also be really great to see some of these ideas applied more specifically to different target groups. I was at the Association of Internet Researchers Conference in Phoenix a couple weeks ago, which is a really great academic conference for exactly what it sounds like. And Laura Denardis, who's here running around doing internet governance wisdom, and one of her graduate students presented a really awesome paper on how internet governance intersects with LGBT rights. They've promised to send me that paper, and they're getting it ready for publication and everything, but I would love to see a similar rigorous academic study on how our different communities, whether it's human rights defenders in a given context, or how does the real name policy apply differently in India versus in Russia versus in the U.S. domestic context, or what have you. So I'm just kind of throwing these out there to hope they kind of spur some inspiration. Becky, I'm going to pick on you since you had so many great comments and questions earlier. Are there any other ideas of research that the academic types of researchers would be in a particularly good place to contribute to, as opposed to the advocacy researchers who bring a different skill set and set of
And to throw another question at you and everyone else, is there, there are different research consortia on different things, and is there kind of the basis for a bit of a research network around this? And if so, how would we support that creation?
Yeah. Well, I sent you an email about something that's available in Canada. I think the Canadians will also know, and you're probably funded by SSHRC for some of the work you're doing. There's something called the Partnership Development Grant, and then that leads to a partnership grant. And it seems to me, and I don't know if the Canadians would see this as similar, but what tends to happen in academia is we tend not to share. We don't necessarily do robust comparative research because we all have these esoteric interests. And so there are quite a number of people, at least in the media communication studies area, that do immediate industries research. And there is a community of people there's a new journal for that and all this stuff. So it is possible, and these are international, it's not just, in one country, but I think that this is a really interesting project because it has a sustainability, it does several things. It builds knowledge about the industries, so those people that we're supposed to be training in universities, unfortunately I'm not in a think tank, but I'm supposed to train students, right? But the students, what do you train them on in this field? There's just there's such a bifurcation of issues and stuff like that. It seems to me there's a robust agenda that several university partners might want to think about doing together as a way to sustain the research and have that academic integrity that you need, because if it's a voluntary project, which I think is helpful as sort of a participant research project, advocates and their constituencies would be learning about things, but I think that the rigor, you'd have to, it's just a different exercise, and it's important, both of them are important. But aside from that, it seems to me that it also informs practice. So in a way, there's a research, teaching, training, and practice dimension that this thing sort of is in the middle of. And what's so interesting about it, if it could scale, you could do all sorts of visualization projects. You could use it as a there's this whole thing of digital humanities, and people are looking for stuff to visualize, and this is like perfect. Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, it's actually something we could organize pre-conferences around at several conferences that intersect, as you said, the internet studies field intersects with so many disciplines and studies areas. But the other thing that's interesting is the possibility of having research that also tracks the uses of the index, which would be something very interesting to me. So that how is it being used? So it's more in the area of monitoring and evaluation, but it could be, academic papers could come out of it, and I could see people wanting to, coming into this field. There was, at the orientation session, there were so many, I would say, newer generation folks that seemed to be very eager, and there's a lot of people coming from universities. It would be really exciting to think about how to put several projects together if there were a group of academics who wanted to collaborate, which is like herding cats. But that's possible. It's possible. And I think a lot of people in the room that could probably find those people. So anyway, there's just lots of ideas. There's actually some funding sources that could be used for some parts of it, and then other donors could come in and pitch in on different things. But I would be willing to help with that. I think it'd be fun. Yeah.
Great. That's what we love to hear. Yes.
It just occurred to me, I was here a couple of hours ago, and we were saying how the big telecom and internet companies do not focus on users, right? And I thought about your book, Consent of the Network, and how we are applying, well, you are applying, we all think about it, but this is the research point. These human rights are applied to companies, and it's like an exigence to actually comply with them. So I was just wondering, thinking about this consent of how we are being governed by all these companies, especially on the internet, and our human rights are being constantly violated, even though there's no international regulation that can say it like that. But I was thinking if there could be any research regarding the consent of the users, like research focused on the users contractually, for example, or I've read some of them in the United States, but only in the United States. But what about, I don't know, I'm from Mexico, so people in Mexico that don't understand the entire Facebook contract but still accept it. Like, what part do they accept, what part not? I don't know, like, I always think about that, and in terms of this consent, it would be very interesting because we haven't, as a human rights lawyer, I haven't gone that far into contractual law to think about this link between democracy, human rights, and contractual consent.
Was there a hand on this side? I thought I saw, yeah? Thanks, Ella.
My comment touched a little bit on the advocacy and the research, because I think those two kind of overlap. Basic comment on, I believe context matters here. And first of all, I'm Babette from Internews. Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. And we work with a lot of local advocates in the world, and most of them are interested in this tool, and I know they could benefit from this tool for the advocacy effort. So in terms of context, I know we've talked with Rebecca about localizing the tool to some of the country, at the country level, and there was an agenda for translation. So my first question was like, what is the next step when it comes to translation? Because I think it's really important for non-English speaker. That would be the first step, to use this tool and kind of adapt it to the local context. In terms of localizing the tool, I believe this research had a very academic kind of research framework, and our partner probably have like advocacy research skill, but not necessarily like the academic research framework. As they using this tool and trying to adapt it to the local context, what is the role that an organization like Internews, because we don't have that background when it comes to academic research, how can we work with RDR in terms of working with our partner locally to, when they're adapting the tools, knowing the limitation that you have with resources and staffing, like how that could be done, just to make sure that the research kind of follow that academic framework and that we're not doing something completely different. Last but not least was, I wanted to say that the research, once the partner, let's say a partner in Mexico, I'm just picking one country, is using this tool and trying to adapt it to the local context, they're definitely going to identify some policy bottlenecks that they can use for advocacy in the country. Because what I've heard recently, I was recently at the Stockholm NN Forum, and there was a panel with the company that I would not name, and then an advocate from a country that I would not name. But then what I've heard was that, from the company, was that you've never been pointed a gun, like there's literally like someone pointing a gun to their head to shut down a network. And from the advocate, it was like, well, we wish we knew about those challenges so we can work together. So I definitely think this could be used as, this research can be used at, setting the tone for more transparency and accountability from company, but there needs to be a dialogue between civil society and companies.
Yeah. Let me touch on the translation question, and then I'm going to back up to our case studies to answer the second one. So as Rebecca has mentioned a few times, everything on our website is Creative Commons. So if somebody, some individual organization wants to go ahead and translate anything on our site, whether it's the indicators or some of our background research, the report, go ahead. Nobody needs to ask for permission. We'd like you to let us know so that we can help you distribute it. If it's one of the languages that somebody on staff speaks, we can kind of help you and whatnot. That's actually more languages than you would think for how small our team is.
Yeah, just to interject, I mean, this is one of the things that if we had budget to do, we would have lined up people to start translating the day after we put out the report. Volunteer translation is great. Sort of edited and checked translation for something like this, given the nature of the information and kind of the sort of issues around it, would be even better. So we're among the things I'm looking to fund with my begging bowl is translation into at least a few languages. But we can talk more about that offline.
And that was the next thing I was going to say, is that we definitely believe in paying people for their work. So, but like Rebecca says, the begging bowl needs to be filled up. Your second comment touched on, I think, could be summarized as advocate-based research versus academic research, right? So something that that the team learned before I started being involved with the project in the case studies is that different kinds of people with different kinds of skill sets will produce different kinds of research. And so the people who were contracted to do the case studies that were mostly based on a single country with a few exceptions had the most impressive credentials in international human rights law, in broader law, in public policy, in international affairs, and so on. And they were really top-notch people. But for the most part, they didn't really have experience researching companies. And so the project that I started doing when I first joined the project as a fellow a year and a half ago was to read through these reports and kind of figure out what the big takeaways were. And it was like a stack of paper this high on my desk. It was great. And one of the things that struck me was that they had written us really, really great legal analyses of the policy and legal context in those countries, but that there wasn't the kind of information about companies that we, with the knowledge gap that we were trying to fill, right? And that's not a critique of anyone who was involved. Everybody did a really bang-up job. It's just that the people that we needed to be doing that research was the type of people who wound up doing it, like the people from Sustainalytics and some other folks who have that kind of experience of researching companies and doing investor-focused research as opposed to legal analyses. And so, and the other thing that came out of that case study process and reflecting back on those lessons learned was to figure out what questions we could answer in any country in the world without having to go deep into like, okay, well, in this country, it's the First Amendment that protects this. In this country, it's the Charter of Fundamental Rights. In this country, oh, well, in this country, there's no law for this, and so on. So, so that's why it's based in the Regi principles and in the GNI principles and more broadly speaking in international human rights instruments, and not specifically in laws and not adapted to local context and making specific references to local laws. We did have some of our researchers suggest, because we asked them, like, how do you think these draft criteria should be? And now that you've been working with them for a little while, how should we improve them? And we did get some pushback from researchers who said, well, in my country, the phrase human rights is not something that people really think about. If you maybe rephrase it as user rights, or were more specific, or, the country that I work in doesn't really care about the UN human rights principles, but if you grounded it in domestic law, then companies would be a lot more interested. And so our response was like, well, yeah, but considering that your country's laws mandate that companies violate their users' rights, that's not going to be terribly helpful. And you can imagine any number of countries that would fit under that description. So does that kind of answer your question? Yeah. Ellen, do you have anything to add? Sounds good. Some countries violate human rights. Great. So in terms of so there seems to be some rough consensus that'd be great to have a research network of advocates and academics and independent researchers and people who float across all those categories. But how do we coordinate that? Are there any groups that you're a part of or that you've observed that have a really good way of organizing broad, dispersed, amorphous groups of researchers, or are there any particular pitfalls that you could warn us off of?
to add to the pile of questions for people to think about, how can we be helpful? Obviously, you know, I did a sort of quick tour of the website and so on, but you know, we'd love to hear from people if we can help you use our data, or you know, what else you might need from us that that we're able to provide in terms of helping you get going on research, or what kind of support in terms of just information and guidance might we be helpful with. Listserv.
More emails.
Oh, thank you. Sorry for being late. I didn't get all the information, but I really want to congratulate for this very bold and useful initiative. I just read the recommendations, which are very useful. My name is Xian Hong from UNESCO. I think it's very useful for IGO like UNESCO. We are advising our member states on regulating the internet intermediaries companies. It's a really very obvious results, which you can really wake up and show the risks. And some of my thoughts and questions is first, in your research, have you observed any correlation between the free speech and the privacy? For example, in the case where a company, the more they respect free speech and they also respect privacy better, or there are also maybe any conflicts between them, maybe they couldn't, they have to reconcile both, or is any correlation analysis in this research? Secondly, that because there's so many different categories of internet company, and now you start from the service provider and the telecommunication, are you planning to look at other different categories of the intermediaries in the future? And also from the program level, would a country level indicator analysis be useful?
Mm-hmm.
Because imagine these companies are operating in different countries, which they have different legal environment. This can greatly impact their performance in this chapters. So to a certain extent, it might be unfair to compare some company with other, because basically they cannot do it. So I wonder if that makes sense to compare the company in one country, so you can see clearly the total engine, the trend. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Shen Hong. Actually, Alon and I and some of our other colleagues worked with Shen Hong on a report for UNESCO on internet intermediaries last year. And the research we did for that report kind of helped us as we were thinking through the indicators and methodology for this ranking. So really appreciate that, and continuing to have a dialogue with you, Shen Hong, and others. To answer your questions in reverse order, absolutely, I think there's a lot of interest from many, both academics and civil society groups, on doing country-level rankings, and that would be extremely meaningful, and perhaps where the real power can be. That this is really just kind of an initial framework conversation starter in a way, and just pointing towards a set of methods and questions and indicators that people can use at the national level. And we really encourage people to do that and to adapt our methodology to local conditions. And you know, hopefully we can kind of have a network of researchers doing that at a national level. As for other kinds of companies, as we discussed earlier, we are very much hoping to be able to have the resources to rank more categories of companies. And, you know, Apple should be in here. People are asking me every day, where's Apple? Where's Amazon? You know, and also asking me about, you know, certain other Chinese companies and certain other companies in different places. And so definitely it would be good to be able to include more types of companies and to broaden the methodology to do that. So we're hoping, you know, again, it's always a matter of resources. And we're working on just being able to repeat this scope, but hopefully to expand the scope and then be able to do it annually. But we're still working on resources. But that's certainly the intention. And then the first question.
Correlation between privacy and free expression.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think some people might have assumed that, you know, a company that's good on free expression wouldn't be good on privacy. That wasn't actually the correlation that we found. That the strongest performing companies did well on both. There was a trend among a number of companies that have actually gotten much more robust about transparency reporting and disclosure about privacy, and have really neglected the freedom of expression side. And I don't think it's because of their privacy practices. It's just that because of the Snowden revelations, everybody's focusing on surveillance, which, you know, rightly so. But I think that the issues around content removal and content restriction and account restriction got a little bit buried in the past few years, and some companies are just coming back to it. So, for instance, a week, you know, after we had finished our research and we couldn't add any new data, Microsoft issued a new transparency report where for the first time they included content restriction. And before that they had only had data, you know, privacy-related data requests. And so there's quite a lot of companies that only have surveillance, you know, user data requests in their transparency reports and have no information about content restriction in their transparency reporting. And we're hoping that the effect of this might be to shed light a little bit on the need for more robust transparency around freedom of expression related things. But we haven't noticed that they've been in tension. And, you know, Alon and Natalie, you can comment on this. I mean, there's sort of a conventional wisdom that the two are kind of polar opposites, and there are certainly some issues around, you know, when one user feels like another user violated their privacy and wants that content removed, and kind of how that dynamic works, and of course the right to be forgotten and so on. But what we're really looking at in this index relates not to sort of how much content you take down, but are you transparent about what you're taking down? So in terms of, are you transparent about what you're taking down? Do you have an appeals process? Are you being accountable about what you're doing? Are you being clear about whose authority you're doing this under, and so on? So in that sense, with this methodology, with this set of indicators, the privacy and the freedom of expression, we haven't found them to be in tension with one another, because in both cases they're within the human rights framework, which is that neither right is absolute either, right? So we're recognizing that within international human rights norms, all rights exist kind of in relation to other rights. And there are legitimate restrictions on rights if they are necessary and proportionate and done in an accountable manner and so on. But the issue is that we need accountability and transparency and so on going on with the companies. So, Alon, you want to add something?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. So we don't, for example, in terms of freedom of expression, it's not that if a company would say, we allow you to do whatever you want on our platform, say whatever you want, that we would give them a 100% score. Yeah. That's totally not what we're after and what we're looking for. We are asking for companies to be completely transparent about what the rules are, how they enforce these rules, how to deal with third-party requests to take down certain content, et cetera, but there's no sort of dichotomy where indeed all free expression would allow for all content to be put up there, which could potentially be privacy risk or privacy violation. But since we don't approach it in that way, I don't think there's any sort of indicator that would bring the two in tension with each other.
But that's a really, really key question. And probably some fruitful areas for research as well in terms of how companies balance these things.
Any other points of concern, ideas, suggestions, things that you'd like to do with the information that we've put out, or that you think we should be doing differently?
While everybody's wheels are spinning in little thought bubbles above your head, there's one other area of potential use for this that didn't occur to me while we were brainstorming the agenda for this session, which is how can this be a tool for education? You know, I mean, it's come up either explicitly or kind of implicitly a number of times that either it's not at all obvious to people who work within companies why they should do things that they're not mandated to do by the law. I mean, you know, my gut reaction to that is like, but because it's the right thing to do, what kind of a person are you, right? That's my gut reaction, right? But educating, can this be used to educate either people who are already working in the private sector or business school students? You know, I mean, different business schools have varying emphases on ethics and respect for human rights in their curricula. Some care a lot, some don't mention it at all. Is this something that we could you know, be reaching out to MBA faculty, for example, and say, hey, do you want, maybe you should do some case studies, we can help you, we can suggest guest speakers that are not prohibitively far away from where your business school is, and so on.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting, just a footnote there, and then go to Luis. But I actually approached a business school that I won't name about working with them on this, and it was earlier on, and they're like, oh, but we get money from some of these companies, and, you know, we're worried about upsetting them, and so, we're not sure, you know, we want to focus on innovation or, you know, social impact or something, and so, yeah, it was kind of a little more challenging than one would have hoped, which...
And there again, my gut reaction as the human rights activist is, what kind of a terrible person are you, unnamed business school? You know, but obviously that shouting that at them is not the most fruitful way to engage them. But let's go to Luis and then back to Becky. I think she had a hand up.
Well, just very quick. First, I mean, since we are an organization, R3D, that works on these issues, we are more than, I mean, thinking about it, we need to relate our efforts more so we don't duplicate work. I think in any case, I think the work that we've done help, for example, assess American Mobile probably, and this now helps us also, I mean, two companies of this operate in Mexico, American Mobile and AT&T now, although you qualify AT&T operations in the U.S., but still, it's an advocacy tool that it's interesting. But I think we need to figure it out. Probably won't today, but figure it out a way in which all the people and organizations and academics that are working on these issues, we can work together and pool our resources. No? But I wanted to more like make a question, because, for example, I mean, it hasn't happened, but it might happen, that a company tells you, okay, I understood the message, help me be better. Like, how do you, I mean, because there's a tension there about the neutrality that you want to have by doing the ranking, and also the opportunity to really seize the opportunity to modify and change the policies of a company that is willing to do it. So how do you navigate that, or which ideas, or has it happened? Would you be willing to just say, okay, I'll take your word, and you need to do this and this and this and this, or it's just a question that I have for you.
That's a really good question, and I think it speaks to a lot of issues. And I know there's probably a couple people in the room who've worked for organizations like the Center for Democracy and Technology and the EFF and some others that do work confidentially. You know, they have their public-facing advocacy, but they also do have a lot of confidential conversations with companies about, you know, here are some problems you're having, and here's our suggestions for how you should improve. So it does seem that in some contexts that some NGOs manage to kind of do both, but it's also a delicate balance. It seems one way to have those conversations has been, actually this is one place where the Global Network Initiative, at least when it comes to government request related issues, has been a really useful forum, and Eduardo's in the GNI as well, because it provides sort of a neutral place for companies to reach out to NGOs for advice and have some difficult and sometimes contentious conversations while, you know, nobody's kind of doing consulting or, you know, anything like that. It's more kind of within the context of a conversation among stakeholders in which everybody's sort of committed to saying, okay, we want to help industry move forward. And so then it's also less of a one-on-one relationship and more of a relationship through a multi-stakeholder organization where all the stakeholders involved sort of have committed to work together to improve. So, you know, maybe part of it is to try and get these companies, you know, on the one hand, having one-on-one conversations is great, but also maybe try and get them to work more within a multi-stakeholder context. You know, I don't know to what extent, you know, it's America Mobile would join, you know, GNI or Industry Dialogue or something like that, but at least kind of show up for some conversations. Sometimes that helps too. And I've, you know, before the GNI was formed, I was involved with some meetings that eventually led to the formation. But it wasn't just one company, you know, it was several companies and it was several NGOs. And I was also in meetings where it was one company, but like 5 NGOs all kind of talking to the company about what they should do. And so sometimes that also helps, because then it prevents you from being accused of having some kind of, you know, incestuous relationship, or, you know, oh, we saw them going out for drinks, or, you know, something like that. And you know, that's more kind of above board, and so people can kind of vouch for it, but you can have a difficult, you know, private or semi-private conversation to help them improve. But I guess there have been some contexts where there's been kind of different approaches to create sort of a safe place for. Also, I found, particularly within the GNI context, where we, you know, ended up creating this organization, we got, you know, it's not a perfect thing by any means, but at least it got companies to make some commitments and be assessed on certain things. And part of it was also the NGOs coming to the table and saying, look, we have some things to learn too. We have some things to learn about the challenges your business faces. We have some things to learn about how things work. And so it's not just a one-way street. We actually want to come together, learn from each other, and then talk about solutions collectively. And so any way to convene those types of conversations, you know, I think maybe in the cultural context in different places is different, and how to start those conversations in a way that people feel safe and they feel like they're not compromised maybe is quite different from place to place, or maybe it's similar. You know, or sometimes bringing in an external party that's neutral and not local, sometimes that helps, sometimes it hurts. You know, it's sort of, again, it depends on the place. You know, sometimes bringing in some, you know, like the Berkman Center or something like that, you know, as some, you know, with a big university brand, and, you know, the CEOs want to, or the executives want to show up in something that says Harvard on it, you know, and then you can kind of create a place for a conversation that you could also have down the street, but somehow it becomes easier if you put some university brand on it. And that's frankly another role that academic institutions can play, is just providing these neutral convening places for different stakeholders to talk to companies in a place that's not so scary for the companies. Because sometimes, I remember 10 years ago when we first had the G&I initial conversations, it was really, really scary for certain executives to go talk to Human Rights Watch. It's really frightening. And they've lost their fear over time, at least certain companies have. But it was because there were some universities that provided sort of a neutral academic setting that all sides felt, the human rights groups also felt like they weren't being tainted, to have that conversation. So maybe it requires some kind of creative thinking about what kind of conversation platform is sort of the most objective and neutral convening place somehow,
Yeah, I had a thought, but I think it's better just to hang on to it for a bit. I'm not ready to go on.
Would you pass the mic behind you? There was a hand. Thank you.
So when Alan announced this meeting, and I was very anxious to come to the session, when he announced it in the morning when we were looking at different questions of violence against women online and how companies are dealing with that and if there's responsibility or liability or any sort of commitment whatsoever, I was so excited to come. And then when you said, oh, in terms of service across the board, nothing. So I was just wondering, that there's no how much the content takedown or how much action is taken based on their own terms of service. You had said that there was interest from some companies of exploring this more. One of the demands that we've had in the Association for Progressive Communications and other people that have been working on the Take Back the Tech campaign is just to have a lot more clarity about those processes that go on. And we do have more now than we did even 3 years ago when we were looking at their policies and finding that for women across the board, whether it's in Pakistan or whether it's in Mexico or whether it's in Colombia, they had different realities for success in terms of their requests. And I think that companies have really made changes in the last 3 years, dramatic changes in the way they're addressing issues of violence, of death threats, of rape threats, of non-consensual dissemination of intimate photos, etc. So one area I really think would be fantastic to pressure on or see what you think is possible in general terms, and not maybe just you all, if other people in the room have had success around terms of service. But the other is just reporting how many, without revealing how, I guess we're being innocent, or what is the word, naive, when you're saying, well, why can't you just tell us how many reports you're getting about violence online and how many you respond to positively? That sort of thing too. And so I was wondering if that's on your radar or what sort of reaction you were getting from the companies in this area. And I think it's something as well when you look at connectivity providers or cell phone providers, because they absolutely do not want to have anything to do with this. So since there's no moral commitment to addressing harassing phone calls, and it changes country to country, there's like an unsaid policy in Bosnia that came up that said if you're getting harassing phone calls from one number, then they could be blocked. You could easily block it at that level. Someone found this out, but it was like this, they just found it out that they could do it. It's not something publicized. So in those veins, it would be very interesting if you have seen anything specifically thinking about violence against people, against women, or gender-based violence, which affects many other minorities.
Yeah, just really quickly while the mic's being passed. We did actually hear from a couple of companies that said if we report the number of reports we receive and then the percentage we responded to, it'll just make everybody angry at us, and it'll actually just bring more censorship pressure, and it might not actually help. So I think this is where we need to actually have a concrete conversation about, okay, zero transparency is not acceptable. However, what kind of transparency would actually be productive? I think there's, at least among civil society, a view that it's too much of a black box. It needs to improve. But exactly how the reporting needs to happen in a way that really helps people identify the issue and solve problems and prevent abuse and this kind of thing, I think requires a very long set of conversations over a long period of time and a lot of work, and probably more research also. about user behavior, about company practice, about user experience to really tease out what's the best way forward.
I'm sorry if I change a little bit this part of the conversation, because we have been discussing during the last hour or talking about future research, how to build on new research on this. But I don't think that we say that it would be important to strengthen this research over the time. Because any index, let's think in the Freedom House Index, I mean, any index at the end has some sort of political tool. I mean, in terms, when I say political tool, is you want to change something using the index. So if this work, great work, is just a photo, it's just a one-shot project, that means that this is the situation now, right now. But we mentioned, this is evolving very quickly. So what are the plans to strengthen this project? Because over the time, strengthen means do exactly the same in 2 years, because it is highly possible that many companies start changing their, rules. So maybe they are going to change in the ranking. And it will also be possible that other companies want to be in the ranking as well. So I think that it's important to think on new research, more partners and so on, but we need to think in strengthening this, to have this, over the time, and every, 2, 3, 4 years have this index again. And in 10 years, we can see the trend, we can see the changes, and that will be important. Okay.
Just a really quick thing, thinking about neutrality and transparency. I browsed your webpage. I haven't seen all of it, but I was wondering if you published where you got your financing resources.
That in a couple of places. One is in the FAQ. What is your relationship between Ranking Digital Rights and New America, which is our host organization, and also where does your funding come from? But we also have a page, let me just go up here again, sorry. In the Who We Are, we have a page on funders and partners, and it lists all our current and former funders and also research partners, and so on. And then we have, in terms of who has helped us with research, we only have three full-time staff, but in terms of all the people who have done research with us on a short-term contract basis or volunteer basis, in different capacities, partnership basis, we have a whole list of everybody who's been involved with the research at different stages. So we're trying to be as transparent as we can about that. And I mean, to be honest, one of the, right now the project is housed within a think tank within a think tank. But we're sort of independent within the think tank within the think tank. So the New America Foundation, full disclosure on the website, their board, Eric Schmidt is chair of the board, which is actually quite problematic for our project, but, and OTI, which is also our kind of think tank within the think tank in between New America and us, they also get funding from a number of companies for policy-related projects. This project is kind of firewalled against all corporate funding, and I run it, and nobody at New America or on the board or at any level has ever tried to intervene in, or frankly, I'm not sure how much attention people were paying until recently into what I was doing in the first place, or what we were doing, I should say, because we were just sort of running our own thing. So, you know, that's kind of more information than we put on the website because, you know, it's kind of broader context. But there have been some people who've raised the question, you know, should you be an independent NGO? Should you be in a university? You know, what would be the best kind of positioning for the project? And, you know, this is where we are because this is where I was when I started the project. But I think we do want to I think ideally this should be kind of a consortium, and it should be owned jointly, I think, by a number of institutions of different types. That might be kind of the best for its independence, but we certainly need to continue to be very transparent about, you know, who's funding it, who it relates to, in what way, and, you know, I mean, there's always lots of, if somebody wants to attack us, there's plenty of ways in which they can try to do so and, you know, find some audience. But we, you know, all our data is there. You can see how we did the research. You can see the sources we used. You know, you can see the reasoning behind it. So hopefully people can, you know, argue on the merits of the research and, you know, rather, you know, in the spreadsheet, it doesn't say we gave Google X score because Eric Schmidt called me and told me to, you know, that it's basically here's the source and here's how it compared to, you know, and we applied the same standard on these sources for this company as we did for this company. And, you know, you can go through the data and look question by question, indicator by indicator, and, you know, judge for yourself whether we applied consistent standards to all the companies. You know, which is why it's just so important for us to put everything there. And so, yeah, but it's definitely, you know, we welcome questions, and if I also welcome suggestions for things that we're not clarifying on here that we should make more clear, you know, please let us know, because we definitely don't want people to feel that we're being less transparent than we're expecting from others, certainly.
Becky.
Yeah, I just wanted to ditto my colleague's comment about you've got something built. I think the challenge is to keep it going, enrich it, try to find ways to sustain it and measure its use, because once it starts being used and its effects start showing up, then people start wanting to contribute to it because it actually has an effect. But the question is, you won't know what that is unless there's a way to figure that out. But as a researcher, it's always like, well, what do you, there's a push-pull question that you've posed at the same time. We can help you push it out. Like, here's this data set, you know, would you like to use it? That's not very difficult. The question is, what kind of research support do you need is the question that, you know, it's hard to, I mean, I don't know that.
Right.
So, I mean, I think that maybe a set of asks, a set of resource questions, a set of things like that could help us help you find people to participate, and then it'd be more concrete, and there's many ways to push it out there.
That's a really good question, and I can sort of give you some concrete examples right now in terms of how academia in particular can help us out. The reason Natalie has been working with us is that she, 2 summers ago, was a fellow with us, supported by Annenberg.
My department.
Right, and so USC, University of Pennsylvania, kind of have these Annenberg schools, and there's this fellowship.
Were you a Compass Fellow?
Yes,
she was a Compass Fellow, exactly. Another person who's been heavily involved with the index from the beginning was a Compass Fellow before Natalie, Tim Liebert, at University of Pennsylvania, and we've now gotten him an Open Technology Fund Fellowship to continue working with us on methodology development for our phase 2, including devices and software and so on. So I guess the point is that in both of these examples, and there's a few other examples of some other graduate students who've found funding to work with us and, you know, do the primary and peer review research on the index itself. So Tim did the primary research for all of the US-based internet companies for the freedom of expression and privacy indicators. And Natalie did some of the peer review, and she also did some of the earlier methodological development work. And in both cases, the work they did for us directly relates to their PhD dissertation research. So, so they're getting funding to work from other sources to work with us, and it benefits their academic work, but it also enables them to apply their work very directly. So one way that academia could help, I suppose, is that if there are different types of fellowships that kind of blend research with practice, and there are a number in various institutions around, just to let people know that we could be a host organization for PhD students that are interested in working on these issues. In exchange, they're going to need to help us do the primary research for the next, they're going to spend some weeks or months buried in spreadsheets, poring over privacy policies and terms of service, to help us actually do the research for the next round. But in exchange, they'll not only get kind of a ground level view, but they'll, so Tim Liebert, who's not with us, is doing some other papers that are based, very directly on some of the very specific work, primary research he did for us, and combining that research with other research he's done. So
And
most
likewise,
certainly.
sorry to interrupt,
Yeah,
but
no
likewise,
problem.
I've had a few peer-reviewed publications based directly on my work with Ranking Digital Rights, going to various conferences related to ranking digital rights has helped me do data collection for my dissertation, which is related but not directly overlapping. So there's a lot of I wouldn't be here if there weren't a lot of benefits to being a ranking digital rights affiliated PhD.
I can see that. It's just that what's really what we probably need to do is have a conversation about how to scale that up.
Sure.
Because I think those are wonderful opportunities that happen to people that are in the Annenberg network, and they don't happen. There's a huge program that could bring people from Latin America into this whole thing, and there's other ways to sort of share in the data collection, the data analysis, and also create cohorts.
Yeah.
And an edited book on the thing would then produce.
Totally.
There's a lot of stuff that scholarship can do to kind of create the space that produces this into something that then people start using.
Absolutely.
In many different ways.
Yeah,
So I think that would be.
If there were some kind of fellowship that was global, that enabled us to locate graduate students in a range of different countries who we could work with, and then they could, or professors too, although oftentimes professors already have so many things to do but academics more broadly, but graduate students tend to be the people who are most in a best position to do this, but also work with their advisors and their faculty who are hoping to kind of beef up in this area and beef up programs in this area, to create a research network.
So maybe what I could maybe suggest to create an academic working group or that people can decide to be part of and have this conversation continue. And
That would
maybe
be
I'm
awesome.
not sure how to.
Let's create that. Would you like to chair it?
Sure. But I don't want to chair alone.
No, you
Okay.
co-chair. We have
Happy
a grad
to do that,
student
sure.
and a professor.
Yeah, that'd be great. Recruiting more now.
Yeah.
We can make Tim play too.
Yeah, we'll drag him in. Great. Anything else? Anybody else want to be part of this working group? Come let us know. Get in touch. You have our email. There's info@Ranking Digital Rights, but we can all give you our emails as well if you come up afterwards. So, yeah.
And if you have any ideas pop up in the next 48 hours or so,
We're around.
We have our other workshop on Wednesday.
That's right. Absolutely. We can't forget. Why don't you plug the workshop?
Sure. So on Wednesday at 11 a.m. in a room whose number is on the internet.
It might be 7. I'm not
or
sure.
some
Or
other
maybe
digit. They've changed it a few
yeah,
times.
they keep changing.
So,
yeah.
If you tweet at Ranking Digital Rights, I'll make sure to find it. So we'll have a discussion more broadly on best practices for benchmarking corporate entities on respecting digital rights. As we've alluded to, RDR is far from being the only organization working on this space, which is fantastic. We'll have somebody from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Peter, who was here earlier from Access, will be on the panel. Kelly Kim from OpenNet Korea, who I think was falling asleep, which might be why she left.
Jet lag.
Yeah, Korea's far from here, guess what? And I also haven't slept in a while, so I'm actually forgetting who else is on our own panel. But
let's
Rebecca,
see. We
for
have
sure.
it here. Yeah. We think it's in workshop room 7, by the way, which is next to this. So this is our current list of people. And so there will be discussion of national level as well as other kind of global level projects. Is this a correct and updated list?
To the best of my current knowledge.
Good. It kept changing, as it often does with the IGF.
Yeah, and so as you see, we'll have someone from Facebook and someone from the Swedish International Development Agency weigh in on how those types of actors view these projects and you know, hopefully give us some helpful feedback on how we can be even better than we already are.
Yeah. So great. Maybe we should let people go 15 minutes early unless there's more burning comments. All right. Well, thank you so much to all of you.
Thanks a lot.
And I know some of you hung in here for the whole time, so that's really great. Good job.
Thank you.
You stayed awake. Good job.
I did.
Yeah, thanks so much.